Welcome to the 63rd and almost final installment of my YouTube lecture video series on U.S. westward expansion. Now, this is something that started as a college course, and in fact, I am using these videos in the context of students watching them. It was for a course that already existed called U.S. Westward Expansion. I think that if I had had the opportunity to name the course or rename the course, I would have probably chosen the North American Frontier as the title. Anyhow, we've spent 62 lecture videos and approximately 45 or 50 hours talking about that process of the frontier expanding westward, starting with those original 13 U.S. colonies, while also looking at the context, looking quite a bit at the indigenous cultures of the people who were already here and the effects that this expansion had on them, looking at other people who were involved, like the Mexican people who found themselves at the end of the U.S.-Mexican War no longer in Mexico, but in a different country. And we've looked also quite a bit at not just that process, but how it came to be the sort of thing that U.S. citizens would eventually, actually pretty quickly before they were even the United States, use to define themselves, to define Americanness and what that has meant. But now we're going to take a different tack. Now, there's another course that I have taught that I call the Frontier in the American Imagination. And that course is about the Western genre in all its different aspects, from TV and movies to literature to comics and graphic novels and music and so on. And I haven't made that into a series of lecture videos because probably about 75% of that course is spent watching those things or listening to those things and then talking about them. So that's not the format that would work well in a context like this. But I mention it, the fact that such a class exists, because what we're going to be talking about for this remainder of this video are the sorts of things that I talk about in that class, which is different from a class about the actual history. This is the history of the legend, is how I like to frame it. And by the way, something that I want to point out for those of you who have come across this on YouTube and are joining us here and haven't sat through the whole 45 hours. Since this is primarily something that I designed for contemporary college students, now as I record this, it is 2024, so most of the people that are in these classes of mine were born in the 21st century, a time in which there's been a little bit of a drought in Westerns, though not a complete one. My point is that every time I've taught this class and the other one I described, I discover that out of usually 15 to 20 students, sometimes a few more, there's usually only 2 or 3 that have actually ever watched a Western. And usually those 2 or 3 watch them with their parents or their grandparents. And I've really been surprised, though I shouldn't be, at how much of the kind of popular history or popular memory about the myth of the West has been lost over the last couple couple of generations. It's been surprising to me that some of the figures that I talk about who are very famous that I heard about constantly as a kid are now basically unknown. My point here being that if you're somebody that loves Westerns, you're not going to be getting here an exhaustive history, not exhausting, hopefully, but not a complete history. This is an overview geared toward people who don't know much about the subject or the genre, and that will hopefully compel them or point them in the direction toward some places to get started to explore that genre for themselves. So that being said, let's start talking about the Western fiction genre, or Western literature, which is not the same thing as, like, Western literature, quote unquote, meaning a European or Western society. Let's talk about that first because, that came before the movies and the TV shows and the records and radio programs. And actually, we can point to some specific things as the predecessors and then eventually the prototypes for that genre. Now, if you are a student that's in this class that I'm teaching, or if you're someone who's been following along through all these videos, these next few things that I discuss are going to be things that you've already heard about. I'm just kind of bringing them in here to refresh your memory. So basically, when we're talking about frontier literature, it existed as early as the 17th century in English, the English language. But it wasn't in the form of fiction until the early 19th century, unless you count some of the many plays that were written in the 17th and 18th century that were set in the New World. But we're looking at things that were written with a view of being read off the printed page, not being watched as someone performs them on a stage. So some of those early predecessors included what are called captivity narratives, and you saw a lot of those in the late 17th century, the late 1600s in New England. And more often than not, they were about women who had been captured by Native American Indian warriors during warfare and lived for some period of time in captivity. Sometimes the women are given a byline, like Mary Rowlandson. That's probably the most famous of these, The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, about the capture and captivity of Mary Rowlandson during King Philip's War, which was in New England between the colonists and the indigenous tribes. Sometimes they were about men, but usually about women, because that's was more compelling to readers back in England. And I say these are nonfiction, but they were mostly ghost written, and they mostly fit a very tight sort of formula. So I'm not entirely certain that you could describe them as, authenticated history. But like I said, these were very compelling for audiences, particularly that were a little farther removed from the danger of actually experiencing such a thing. And as you might know, Hollywood has found that to be true as well in the 20th century, with examining stories about white people captured by Native American tribes. There are plenty of other examples of literature set in the North American frontier and written by people living in the British colonies in North America or the early Republic of the United States that found wide readership that sort of even had influence on the way people perceived the frontier, the colonial frontier, and that includes people like Benjamin Church, who was a New England Puritan militia leader and frontiersman, who published this book in 1716, entertaining passages relating to Philip's War. And then, sometimes the title to these things from the 17th and 18th century are longer than some books today, it seems. Anyway, Benjamin Church, probably the first frontier hero in what the area that would eventually become, instead of English colonies, the United States. Another fellow that came along about half a century later, Robert Rogers, who was a hero in the French and Indian War of the 1750s, who wrote about it in a book that also had a wide readership. So he was talking about his personal experiences of fighting against the Native American tribes. However, he presented his opponents in not necessarily maybe a sympathetic light, but not in a dehumanized way compared to the way other folks were writing about Native people at the time. He had some respect for indigenous culture. And then the really big one was not an autobiography like these first two, but was a book that was written to sort of inform the people in Europe and the rest of the English colonies about what was going on in Kentucky and the founding of Kentucky. That was published in 1784, written by John Filson. And he had an appendix in this book that was longer than the actual narrative of the book. And the appendix was about the adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone, pictured there on the left. That's Filson on the right. And it was enormously popular, wound up being quoted widely, and led to Daniel Boone being a sort of a celebrity in his own lifetime. And this was re-released, just the appendix part, as The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone. By the way, one of these two people, interesting fact, one of these two people was killed by Shawnee warriors, and his body never recovered. And it was not Daniel Boone. It was the guy that wrote about him. You could kind of fit this book into the same category, published in 1834, an autobiography that was co-written by David or Davy Crockett, co-written with a colleague of his in Congress, that was extremely popular and helped to make Crockett, like Boone had been before him, a celebrity in his own time. But all these things, although it's true that they were very sensational, that they were very widely read, and that they were very impactful on people's view of the North American frontier, and even despite the fact that some of them were kind of fictionalized, none of them technically were fiction. The first American Western fiction was by James Fenimore Cooper, starting in 1823. Over an 18-year period, he wrote a cycle of novels about Nathaniel or Natty Bumppo, alias the Deerslayer, alias Hawkeye, alias Leatherstocking, that were extraordinarily popular, not just in the United States, but worldwide, making him not just the first Western author in the sense of Western fiction, but also the first American fiction author to get an international audience. So I'm sure you've at least heard of The Last of the Mohicans. So he was sort of writing about initially the frontier. Well, initially, if you go by the chronology of when the stories were set, the frontier of upstate New York, there in the Allegheny Mountains, and then eventually out onto the prairie in the post Louisiana Purchase period. So that was the beginning, and actually, just about a year after Davy Crockett's autobiography came out, the Davy Crockett almanacs started to be published. Initially published in Nashville, and then later other printers in other cities got the franchise. This was before the ability existed to, at least in an affordable way, mass produce things and ship them around the country. These were not really almanacs in the sense of, checking, farmers checking to see when to plant their crops. It was actually short story collections that featured Davy Crockett in very fictional stories, and also other frontiersmen like Daniel Boone or others. And these were incredibly popular. They, by the way, they predated the death of Davy Crockett. He died at the Alamo in 1836, and they continued to be published for about 20 years until I think 1855 is when they finally stopped making them. But they were very influential. Now, not too long after those almanacs started coming out, there was a process developed, some advances in printing that enabled large numbers of pamphlets, books, etc., to pages, huge numbers of pages to be published in a day, which made it possible then to actually produce and sell newspapers, pamphlets, etc., a little bit even cheaper, maybe than before. And this was the dawning of the era of penny dreadfuls, as they were called, or boys' story magazines, which were not so much magazines as they were like tabloids. And they featured adventure stories geared toward adolescent boys. And so those were popular for a couple of decades, and then eventually they were supplanted in popularity by the development of the dime novel, initially produced by a company called Beatles, and then other companies sort of started to imitate their approach, their packaging, and so forth. But these dime novels were little paperback, very cheaply made things that had also adventure stories for the most part. Pirate stories were really popular, and various other kinds. Stories about the early frontier, such as demonstrated here. And those became extremely popular. And then within a few years after the Civil War, around the time those cattle drives were getting started, you started to see some of the Beatles and other of their imitators to put out dime novels, not based on fictional characters, nor even on historical figures, but based on people who were still alive at the time from out west. Now, I spent about an hour talking about these in a previous lecture video that was called Dime Novels and Wild West Shows, so you can get a little more detail there. But you can see some examples here of some of the people who didn't get famous. Well, let's put it this way. They didn't have dime novels made about them because initially they were extremely famous. It was because they were interesting and caught the attention of the writers and publishers of these things, and then that greatly magnified how well known they were and essentially made them really famous. People like Buffalo Bill, Wild Bill Hickok, later Billy the Kid, Calamity Jane, and so forth. Now, Buffalo Bill parlayed his fame that he got from these dime novels into a traveling Wild West show. And you can see that this one, his Congress of Rough Riders, was in operation for a quarter of a century, starting in the 1880s. But actually, he had another one before that, starting in the early 1870s, that was a little bit smaller. So this was the beginning of Western showmanship and exporting sort of the growing mythology of the West to the larger eastern cities and also across the ocean to Europe. In the realm of slightly more respectable literature, as framed at the time, although perhaps only marginally more respectable in the eyes of some, around the same time as dime novels were really picking up a head of steam, no pun intended, in the mid 1860s, these two writers, Bret Harte and Mark Twain, were starting to publish works of fiction, short fiction initially, for in Twain's case, set in the West, in mining camps. In Harte's case, California. Twain's case, Nevada, establishing what would become known as a movement called local color, which is when you write a fictional story set in a specific region and you use the dialect of the people in that region. And this is kind of helping to lay the foundations for people who would come a little bit later and be writing about the cowboy life. And about a decade before them, in the mid 1850s, John Rollin Ridge published a novel called The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the notorious bandit, notorious California bandit, also set in the California gold fields. Now, John Rollin Ridge was the son of Major Ridge, the grandson of Major Ridge, son of John Ridge. So his father and grandfather had been killed in Indian Territory during that, what essentially was a Cherokee Civil War after Indian removal. And John Rollin Ridge, whose Cherokee name was Yellowbird, fled Indian Territory after having killed someone that he suspected of being involved in the killing of his father, and went out to California, and that's where he stayed. Joaquin Murrieta was a semi-legendary Mexican bandit in California in the 1840s and 1850s. So these individuals, all three of them, were setting the stage for what would become Western literature. Karl May was a contemporary of Mark Twain and Bret Harte, although an ocean away. May was a German writer, initially a travel author and also an author of children's adventure stories, who, beginning in the 1870s, started writing stories about a German-American fur trapper known as Old Shatterhand and his best friend, an Apache chief named Winnetou. So American frontier stories about the American West, despite the fact that Karl May had never actually been to the American West, although he claimed to have been, and wasn't 100% accurate on a lot of very basic things. Nonetheless, these characters in particular became extraordinarily popular in Germany and are still regarded with great fondness by a lot of German readers, and had a huge influence on German culture. These books by Karl May were as popular or more so in Germany than any of the authors we're going to look at coming up were in the United States. And by the way, there are still a lot of good Westerns and good Western authors in German. Well, the next stage in development of the Western literature genre came in the 1890s. Now, there was a magazine called Argosy that had started coming out around, I think, 1882, 83, and initially it was children's stories and interesting stories of nonfiction stories and factoids and what have you. They didn't do real well. They just kind of limped along until a new owner tried a new approach in 1896. He got rid of all the nonfiction stuff and just featured adventure stories, and he sort of, well, they had colorful covers, as you can see here, which, if you recall, those dime novels we just looked at did not. And he offset the cost of producing those colorful covers by using just absolutely the crappiest paper available, pulp paper, which is why the magazines that followed in the wake of Argosy, starting in 1896, were called pulp fiction magazines. So those became extraordinarily popular and supplanted the dime novel. And if you'll notice, initially, for a long, long time, actually, they were still just a dime themselves. Because again of that offsetting by using the really cheap paper. Argosy, by the way, stayed in print until the late 1970s and has been revived. There have been several attempts to revive it since then, off and on. But just if you look at the consecutive issues, it lasted almost a century. However, it more importantly than that, its popularity in the early 1900s, like roughly, let's say, circa 1900 through the 1920s, inspired so many imitators that it became an entire, both a medium and a genre unto itself. And there were all kinds of different pulp fiction magazines and all kinds of different adventure stories. You know, Tarzan by Edgar Rice Burroughs debuted in a magazine like this. In fact, I think it might have been Argosy, I'm not sure. Written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, that we actually met a couple of lectures ago when he was a young man in the 7th Cavalry in the 1890s. And pirate stories and a lot of crime stories, but there were also a whole lot of Western stories being published in these magazines. The next big step in the evolution of the Western genre came right on the heels of the introduction of pulp fiction in 1902, the publication of the novel called The Virginian by Owen Wister. Now, this was not the first novel to be set in a Western or frontier milieu or setting, but it was the first one to be a bestseller and kind of take the country by storm. So it was the first really successful one. And what sets this apart from stuff that came before, so far as stuff that had been very popular, is that even though those dime novels with stories in them about, Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill and so forth, even though they were ostensibly, even though they were highly fictionalized, they were ostensibly based on real people. This was pure fiction, and it was adult fiction, by which I don't mean that there was sex and swear words in it, but I mean that it was not geared toward 10-year-olds. It was geared toward adult readers of fiction. It was a novel that just happened to be set in the West. It was not a highly sensationalized sort of Buffalo Bill dime novel type thing. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is just a continuation of the local color movement, of which Mark Twain is probably the best known from the late 19th century, right? The idea of writing novels set in particular regions and using the vernacular and dialect of those regions in the dialogue. And Mark Twain, some of his nonfiction was set in the West, but there was a Bret Harte who wrote a lot of short stories set in the West. That was before Owen Wister, but he didn't have any best-selling huge novels that changed the way that people looked at the West, the way Wister did. In fact, an idea, well, a couple of ideas, a couple of facts rather, that show you how significant Wister's influence was. Number one, before you know it, he was pals with Teddy Roosevelt, president at the time the book came out, and lover of all things Wild West. And also today, in the 21st century, the Lifetime Achievement Award given to writers well along in successful careers by Western writers of America is called the Owen Wister Award. So this was extraordinarily influential. Here is a scene from one of the many movie versions of The Virginian, one of the earliest ones, 1929, with Gary Cooper, and the famous line from the book, if you want to call me that, smile. So, somebody says something rude or obnoxious to you. Remember the video about gunfighters and how a lot of those fights started with someone feeling dishonored or dissed or disrespected. So if you're going to say something nasty to me, you better be smiling like you're my friend and showing that you're joking. So this is taking a lot of the existing already by then themes and tropes about the cowboy life, and further solidifying them, delivering them to an even wider audience. And in addition to that, Wister's novel being successful, and by the way, this happens a lot of times when there's a successful novel or movie, a lot of people start imitating it, or at the very least, working in the same genre or subgenre. So there were a lot more than previous novels coming out in the next decade or two that were set in the West. And we're going to look at some of the more influential ones, not just the novels, but also some of the stories and writers from pulp fiction. And we're even going to look at a couple or three nonfiction books that came out in the first couple of decades of the 20th century that also were very widely read and very influential in how people perceived the West. 1 year later, this novel came out, The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. Now, Owen Wister was from a privileged background in Pennsylvania. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School and was a practicing attorney for several years until he took some visits out west and fell in love with it and started writing about it. Andy Adams was raised on a ranch and spent 10 years going on cattle drives to the up the old cattle trails up into Kansas and so forth. So he had actually lived the life. And then after 10 years of that, he became a miner for a while. So he was frustrated by the unrealistic portrayals of cowboys that were already there in literature. And so he wrote a novel that, again, was a work of fiction. It's about a cattle drive. But you know how they say, write what you know. He knew what he was talking about. And so this novel wound up being just an excellent way to learn what life was actually like as a working cowboy. So that really made it stand out. And then he followed that up with several more novels. Now he did not reach the heights of fame and success that Owen Wister did, but he did all right for himself. And perhaps more importantly, at least in my opinion, he remains very highly regarded as a chronicler of the cowboy life. Also in 1903, 27-year-old Jack London, who had published a handful of short stories in literary magazines since his return from the Klondike goldfields, hit the big time with The Call of the Wild, which was followed up in 1906 by White Fang. Now, if you think that stories about the Klondike Gold Rush don't count as westerns, you must not have watched the video right before this one. 1 year after that, in 1904, the writer Clarence Mulford created the character Hopalong Cassidy that appeared over the next 2 or 3 years in several different pulp fiction magazines. Hopalong Cassidy was one of the cowboys at the Bar 20 Ranch, and Mulford wound up eventually writing not just a whole lot of short stories, but 28 novels about Cassidy and the other Bar 20 boys. Hopalong got his name because he had been shot in the leg in a gunfight, and he had a limp. He was portrayed by Mulford as being kind of crude and kind of dangerous. And this illustration on the left is actually it's an illustration from one of the pulp fiction magazines in a 1905 Hopalong Cassidy story. After 2 or 3 years of being able to successfully sell these stories to several different magazines and getting a positive response from them, Mulford released a collection of all those stories, a book called Bar 20, which was just the first of many, many things that he would write about Hopalong Cassidy and the Bar 20 boys. Now, you may have heard the term Hopalong Cassidy before, although I'm not sure. Maybe it depends on your age group. But he became a very popular film character. Starting in 1935, played by William Boyd, who would go on to play him for 20 years or more in first 66 movies. And if you think about that, 66 movies over actually a less than 20-year period for the movies. They were cranking several of these out a year, which tells you something about the budget and the production qualities probably. But they were incredibly, incredibly popular with kids. And after the movies, then there was a long-running television series also starring Boyd. And Boyd's Hopalong Cassidy, which is the one that probably 99% of people who have heard of the character associate with the character, is like 180 degrees different from Clarence Mulford's character. He is well-spoken, reserved, somewhat smooth, always the epitome of fair play and justice, and never smoking or drinking anything harder than milk or sarsaparilla. So that's a little bit of almost, I'm not sure if you would call it irony or not, but it's interesting that someone could create a character that could be presented as very rough-hewn, and the way that character would be imprinted on the public consciousness under the direction of people other than the original author is completely the opposite of that. In 1906, B.M. Bauer published Chip of the Flying U. Now this was another of those ranch life stories, which in this case, like Hopalong Cassidy, became a whole series of novels about the characters living on this ranch. It was a hit, and Bauer went on to write dozens of Western novels, many of them about the characters of the Flying U, eventually selling or seeing 2 million copies of those books in print. Although later on, Bauer's sales dipped significantly when the public found out that BM stood for Bertha Muzzy, which was her mother's maiden name. So B.M. Bauer, one of the first influential and successful women to be Western authors, although not actually the first. That would be Emma Gint Curtis, a fascinating woman who was a suffragette who published and edited a suffragette newspaper and also was very active in the populist movement. When she was in her late 20s, she wrote a couple of novels set in Colorado. The first one came out in 1888, The Fate of a Fool, and it was about an impressionable young music teacher from back east who marries a rancher in Colorado and moves out there only to discover that her husband is the sort of fellow that keeps regular company with prostitutes, and that becomes a huge issue for them. Most of the book is them arguing, actually, about the him defending prostitution and her condemning him for his mistreatment of women and helping to perpetuate the system. So technically, it's on a ranch, and there are a couple of cowboy characters that show up, but the ranching part is not the center of the story. Unlike 1890's The Administratrix, say that 3 times fast, which is about a woman whose husband, a rancher, is murdered, and so she disguises herself as a cowboy, cross-dressing and going undercover to catch his killers, which also has a connection to the suffrage movement, the right for women to get the vote, because her husband was a supporter of her and that movement. But because the whole story centers around cowboys and the ranch life, this novel, The Administratrix, is the one that's considered to be the first novel to be a Western in the sense that we think of them. So why didn't I lead off with this? Why did I start off talking about Owen Wister? Because Owen Wister, within a short time of his book coming out, was a huge success, and Emma Gint Curtis, who had a fascinating life and was herself a very huge success in many ways, did not make a big impact as a writer, not even to the extent that B.M. Bauer did. B.M. Bauer made a huge impact as a writer. These books are extraordinarily rare. Not many of them were printed, and not many of them were bought. But that does not change the fact that really the first Western author, you might could say that, as we did, that James Fenimore Cooper was the first frontier author, but the first Western author in the sense of writing about cowboys and novels was Emma Gint Curtis. Here's somebody you probably didn't think of as a Western writer, because he wasn't, really. O. Henry, the celebrated short story author who wrote, among other things, The Gift of the Magi. I bet you all read that in high school. However, he did live in Texas for about 20 years, and when he was a young man, he worked on a sheep ranch for a while. So he had a little bit of a background in the West. And in 1906, he had a story published in Everybody's Magazine, which was not a pulp fiction magazine, though it later became one. It was a literary magazine at the time. In fact, this is where, a few years later, George Bernard Shaw's story Pygmalion was first published. Anyhow, 1906, he had a story published here called The Caballero's Way, which was a Western, and featured as its main character the Cisco Kid, who was a young outlaw who was kind of brutal, actually, and was being pursued by the law, and he was actually kind of thuggish, kind of an anti-hero, I guess you could say. And despite the fact that He later was represented in media as Latino. The character was a young white guy, a young Anglo cowboy. But that was changed over 20 years later in 1928 when that short story was adapted to film, made into a movie with a different title called In Old Arizona, which starred Warner Baxter as the now Latino Cisco Kid, despite the fact Warner Baxter was not Latino, but that didn't stop them back then. In fact, Baxter won the Academy Award for Best Actor for this film, portraying a Mexican American. And by the way, that was only the second year they had Academy Awards. So with this adaptation to film, suddenly the Cisco Kid became a Latino character, even though he wasn't played by a Latino. To be, well, not really fair, but to be honest, Warner Baxter made a career out of playing Latino characters in a time when you didn't necessarily have to belong to a minority group to portray them. In fact, he did several movies as the Cisco Kid, and then several more were made, including several with Cesar Romero, who was Latino, and with Gilbert Roland, who, despite having anglicized his name, was also Latino, and eventually by Duncan Ronaldo, who was in the last few Cisco Kid movies that were produced in the late 1940s and transitioned into the TV series, which ran for several years. And it was Ronaldo who introduced the look most people associate with the Cisco Kid, which is a charro outfit, a horseman outfit such as that is often worn by mariachi performers. Ronaldo, also not Latino, he was Romanian, but at least I guess that's a Romance language. Anyhow, this kind of reminds me of the situation with Hopalong Cassidy, where you have a character appearing in print that, upon making the transition to film, becomes in many ways the complete opposite of what the character was envisioned by its creator. A more recent version of the character, by the way, was 1994's Cisco Kid movie starring Jimmy Smits as Cisco. Much like Gilbert Roland, despite having an anglicized or an English-sounding name, Jimmy Smits is Latino. And this one had Cheech Marin as his sidekick Pancho. Now, I said this is more recent, but as soon as I said it, I realized that it's at least 10 years older than any of my students. But let's get back to books and the 1900s, shall we? Another significant Western novel that came out in the first decade of the 20th century, Whispering Smith by Frank H. Spearman, who in real life was the president of a railroad company. And his books that he wrote were about railroad detectives. So Whispering Smith is a detective for the Union Pacific Railroad Company. This novel has been adapted as a film 8 different times and also as a television series. Now we move into the 19-teens, which started off with 3 books, 1910, 11, and 12, that sort of all taken together set the foundations for the traditional Western as it would become known. So in some ways, these guys, they've been referred to as among the founding fathers of the Western genre, although as we've seen, there were some founding mothers too, and we'll see some more of those actually. But you had William McLeod Rain, Charles Alden Seltzer, but one might say, granddaddy of them all, Zane Grey. Zane Grey, The Riders of the Purple Sage, that was his second book, I think, but it's the one that catapulted him to fame. And here are just a few of the film versions down through the years of Riders of the Purple Sage. That set Zane Grey down a path of celebrity, which I can tell you doesn't happen with a lot of Western writers. And he was on the bestseller lists consistently for 20 years or more, became a millionaire. Not only did he write many books and also have a lot of film option deals that didn't hurt, he even had his own comic strip. So odds are pretty good that if you're one of my students, your grandfather, or maybe by this time great grandfather, probably had a collection of Zane Grey books. He was the first really big celebrity Western author. Now I want to look just real briefly at one of the nonfiction books from this period that is significant, and it's by our old pal Charlie Siringo. If you've been following these lectures, we've come across him probably 3 times before this. The Cowboy in his early years and Pinkerton Detective later on. And he had written that book about his cowboy years back in 1885 that did pretty well, but also made it a little hard to go undercover. And so near the end of his life, he wrote this reflection on his years as a detective in the Old West. And both of those books, taken together, even though they were, almost 30 years apart in the writing of them, were influential on a lot of fictional Western stories. Also in 1912, The Conquest by Oscar Micheaux, which is, it's a novel, but it was very semi-autobiographical. Oscar Micheaux had moved out as a very young man. He was only in his mid-20s when the book came out. But as a very young man, he had moved out on his own to South Dakota and staked a claim to a homestead and worked on a homestead for several years, and wrote this novel about the experience of an African American man trying to make it as a homesteader. And this came out in 1912. He actually had lost his farm not long before that for his poor finances. That he wrote another novel with a similar theme, The Homesteader, also with an African American protagonist. And then in the late 19 I think The Homesteader came out in 1918. He tried to option it for a film, which is now becoming a thing, and nothing quite worked out. So he scraped together the money and made the film himself, The Homesteader, which was a breakout success, a silent film about homesteading in the Old West, which led to him having a career as a writer and director of silent films. And he was the first really influential and successful black filmmaker. And let's not forget Willa Cather, Pulitzer Prize winner and one of the most acclaimed authors, American authors of the 20th century. Born in Virginia when she was 9 years old in 1883, her family moved out to Red Cloud, Nebraska to become farmers. And when she went on to write about the experience of growing up on the prairie, living on the Great Plains, she did so from personal experience. When she grew up, she wound up working in the magazine business as a journalist. She did some investigative journalism pieces, became an editor, and then in the 19-teens, starting in the 19-teens, a novelist. And these 3 books in particular are known as her Prairie Trilogy. Very highly regarded works, each of them, and taken as a whole, make Willa Cather one of the most important voices writing about the American West in the 20th century. After all, how many of the authors we're talking about today have statues in the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. In 1919, in the pulp magazine All Story Weekly, which later got bought out by Argy, by the way, a writer named Johnston McCulley had a story called The Curse of Capistrano, which featured a mysterious masked figure all in black in old Mexican California who went by the name El Zorro, or the Fox, which was very, very popular. It took off within 1 year of the story being published in this pulp fiction magazine. The first movie version was on big screens with Douglas Fairbanks in 1920, and there have been many, many film versions since. Comic book versions, as you can see on the far left there. A couple of Antonio Banderas productions of Zorro in the late 90s. Most recently, there was a series produced in Spain that has had one season so far as of 2023. It's on Netflix. It has a kind of a different twist to the story, but it's very good. So unlike the Cisco Kid, Zorro was intended to be Latino from the very beginning, although he wasn't always played by Latino actors. Also appearing in All Story Weekly in 1919, a story called The Untamed, the first Western story by Max Brand, real name Frederick Schiller Faust, who would sort of dominate the pulp fiction pages where Westerns were concerned in the 1920s and 30s, and also produce a large number of novels during that time, a couple of collections of poetry as well, and would develop a reputation as one of the all-time great traditional Western authors. He died in 1944 during World War II. He was killed during the war when he was serving as a war correspondent. He was killed by shrapnel. But his books are still in print, and you can still find paperback versions in bookstores easily. By the way, he also wrote Destry Rides Again in 1930, which was a famous movie with Jimmy Stewart, very young Jimmy Stewart, and he created the very non-Western character of Dr. Kildare. Also arriving on the literary scene in the 1920s, Will James, a writer and artist who was actually born Joseph Dufault. He was French Canadian, but decided at a young age what he really wanted to be was an American cowboy. When he was 18, he went to work on a cattle ranch in Saskatchewan in Canada, and then afterward moved down to Montana, and from there to Nevada, and created a whole new persona for himself, going by the name Will James, and telling people he'd been born in Montana but raised by a French fur trapper, and that explained his French accent. Anyway, as a further bit of gaining some authenticity, in 1914 he went to prison for cattle rustling. By the early 1920s, he was getting published as a writer and also working as an artist. And in 1926, he wrote and illustrated this children's book, Smokey the Cowhorse, which is one of the all-time great children's books. Won the Newbery Award the year after it came out in 1927. In 1930, he wrote his life story, which was absolutely, completely fabricated, but had quite a bit of success as both a writer and an illustrator. Another author who had tremendous success writing children's books in the 1930s, set on the frontier, was Laura Ingalls Wilder, whose Little House in the Big Woods came out in 1932 and was the first of several books, a whole series of them, that were published between 32 and 1943, I believe. The third book in the series, Little House on the Prairie, is the title that was chosen for the TV show later in the 1970s based on this. Just like I said, an enormously successful series, which could best be described, I think, as kind of, well, let's say semi-autobiographical children's novels. It was part memoir, but there was also quite a bit of dramatizing and fictionalizing going on for the sake of the story. But all these taken together tell the story of the Ingalls family and their travels west as settlers in the 1860s and 70s and into the 1880s. Edna Ferber was from Kalamazoo, Michigan, the daughter of a Hungarian Jewish immigrant and his American-born German Jewish wife. She wrote a lot of novels. I think her first one came out in 1911. But the three in particular that we're going to focus on are the ones that had something to do with the Trans-Mississippi West. The first one, Showboat, in 1926, about a showboat going up and down the Mississippi River, which was adapted into a musical. That's one of the all-time great American musicals. And also the novels Cimarron and Giant, both of which were adapted multiple times for the big screen. One of my favorite things about Edna Ferber is the dedication that she wrote in her autobiography in 1938. Now, bear in mind, that's right before World War II. She dedicated it this way: to Adolf Hitler, who has made me a better Jew and a more understanding human being as he has millions of other Jews. This book is dedicated in loathing and contempt. Conrad Richter was another Pulitzer Prize-winning American author who wrote a lot about the American frontier. He actually got his start as a writer in pulp magazines in the 1930s, but 1936 came onto the scene in a big way with his novel The Sea of Grass, which was about Old West New Mexico and conflict between wealthy cattle ranchers and the farmers moving onto the land. The novels The Light in the Forest and A Country of Strangers are set in the colonial Pennsylvania frontier and deal with captives, white people taken captive by Lenni Lenape or Delaware Indians. And then these other three novels that came out over the span of about a decade, starting in the early 40s, The Trees, the Fields, and the Town, sometimes called the Awakening Land Trilogy, about the Ohio frontier in the early 1800s. Thomas Savage, who grew up in Idaho and Montana and worked on ranches in his youth, had his first short story published in 1937 in Coronet magazine. It was called Bronkbuster. And in the ensuing decades wrote several novels with frontier or American West themes, a lot of them about ranch life. And in 2021, The Power of the Dog was made into a film that was nominated for a whole slew of Oscars. All four of the actors you see listed at the top were each nominated for an Academy Award, and Jane Campion won the Oscar for Best Director for this film. Ernest Haycock's 1943 novel Bugles in the Afternoon told the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In 1937, he had a short story published called The Stage to Lordsburg, which was the basis of the 1939 film Stagecoach. That was John Wayne's breakout role. So, as often happens with short stories becoming the basis for popular movies, there was a short story collection then issued, including the short story that started the thing, in this case, The Stage to Lordsburg, and then renamed by the name of the movie. Anyhow, Ernest Haycock's one of the best Western authors of the 1930s and 40s. Right after World War II, there was a new publishing phenomenon that was really going to benefit genre writers, particularly Western authors and also science fiction writers of the time period. And that was the advent of the mass market paperback, which was, I think that Pocket Books was one of the first to really push this idea of having a more affordable version of a book that was small enough that you could fit it in your coat pocket. Now, before this, books were released in hardcover, and that was the book release. Okay, so this is the time period when you started to have book racks, kind of like comic book spinner racks in stores with paperback books. And this not only provided an opportunity for popular and successful books that had done well in hardcover to then be released in a cheaper version, but there were a lot of paperback originals, that is, books that never were hardcover, that were released as mass market paperbacks, and that was their first publication ever. And this led to a proliferation of availability of Western novels and also science fiction novels, which, by the way, kind of helped to usher out the pulp fiction magazines, because, you know, now you can get a whole book for not too much more than you were paying for those magazines. So now we're going to look at some of the Western writers who came on the scene after the advent of the paperback. At least, now I say came on the scene, I'm talking about in the sense of getting recognition. Some of them were being published already in the 1940s and some of the 1930s in magazines, pulp fiction magazines, or sometimes higher end magazines. There were magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and others that regularly published short stories. Anyhow, here's one who in 1949 released a novel that became an instant classic. His name was Jack Schaefer, and the novel was Shane. Now, we'll be talking about Shane again later when we talk about movies, but this is the book version, which, just from the cover, if you've seen the film Shane, you can see there's a big difference. Also, he wrote the novel Monty Walsh, that also was adapted to film a couple of times, really, and both of them were pretty good. Jack Schaefer, considered another of the luminaries, another of the all-time greats. As was this guy, Henry Wilson Allen, known to his friends as Heck Allen, who wrote westerns under the pseudonym Will Henry. Also wrote westerns under the pseudonym of Clay Fisher. As Will Henry, he wrote a lot of western novels, and they were very, very good. He wound up winning 5 Spur Awards over the course of his career from Western Writers of America. Now here's another of the all-time greats, Elmore Leonard, who's actually better known today, and has been for probably the last 40 or 50 years, for his crime novels than for his westerns. Westerns is where he got his start in the 1950s. And he wrote some very good ones, a lot of great short stories, including, I think the first one the first one he had published was called The Bounty Hunters, but he wrote one in the 50s called 310 to Yuma, which was made into 2 very successful and very good films, one in the 1950s and one in the 2000s. And of course, also all those detective stories. He also wrote a short story called Fire in the Hole, starring a a deputy United States Marshal named Raylan Givens, present day, who was from Kentucky and who had sort of this cowboy swagger and cowboy attitude about him, which was the basis for the TV show Justified, if you've seen that. Elmore Leonard is, despite the fact that he wrote genre stuff, one of those rare genre writers that has been elevated by the literary powers that be considered one of the best writers, period, of his time period, which was the second half of the 20th and into the 21st century. Here's another of the all-time greats, Dorothy Johnson. Dorothy Johnson. She didn't write many novels. She wrote one or two, but she wrote a lot of short stories, not for pulp magazines, but for the higher end magazines of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, like the ones that I mentioned earlier. And many of those short stories were adapted to film, became classic films that you may have heard of, like, for instance, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, or The Hanging Tree. There was also a story, several stories that she wrote that are classics that were not filmed. Lost Sister is one of them. One of my favorite Western short stories, maybe my very favorite Western short story, was by her. It was called The Boast. And I highly recommend her writing. Now, I didn't mention another of her short stories. I saved it for last. It was called A Man Called Horse. That came out in the 1950s and was adapted in 1970 as a film that had several sequels. The reason I saved it for last is because it was voted a couple of different times when they took these votes. The best Western short story of all time by Western Writers of America, and they used to do those votes about every 10 years or so. They haven't, I don't think, in a long time. But when they did, her story, Man Called Horse, always came up at the very top or near the very top. So an outstanding author that, I highly recommend. Now, here's the guy most people think of when they think of Western novels, Louis L'Amour, who sort of picked up the mantle of Zane Grey, decades after Grey's death, as the go-to Western novel person. And like I mentioned before, when we talked about Zane Grey, I bet if you're one of my students, your grandpa has or had a collection of Zane Grey books and of Louis L'Amour books. He got his start writing for magazines in the 1940s, mostly adventure stories. He had actually gotten started in the late 30s. Mostly adventure stories with an occasional Western. Later kind of picked up on the Westerns. And he had a short story that I think was published in 1951, if I'm remembering correctly, called The Gift of Cochise. Hope you remember Cochise from our previous lectures. It appeared in a magazine, and that magazine was read by John Wayne, who really loved the story and paid for the rights to make a film out of it. And they called the film Hondo. And part of the deal that L'Amour made, L'Amour was very good at making deals, by the way, and very good at promotion. Part of the deal that he had was that after the movie came out, he had the rights to write the novelization of the movie script. So the novel Hondo, which is an adaptation of the movie Hondo, which is an adaptation of the short story, The Gift of Cochise. L'Amour's popularity really took off in the 1960s with The Sackets, which was a series of novels with the same family. Initially 3 brothers, but then we got to meet all their cousins, including their other branch of cousins, the Clinch Mountain Sackets, and then yet another branch called the Talons. There were a whole bunch of these novels, and they were very popular. By the 1970s, Bantam Books was promoting him heavily in ads, in all their paperback books, especially their westerns, and in magazines and stuff. And so in the 1970s, he just was huge and continued to be so and still is today. When he passed away in 1988, I think there were 200 million copies of his books in print. So, like I said, he's the guy most people think of when they think of Western novels. By the way, Down the Long Hills was the first and only Louis L'Amour novel to win a Spur Award. I think that was in 1968 or 69. Now, here is a guy whose name everyone should associate with Western novels. Elmer Kelton started getting published in the 1950s and did so for half a century or more. And remember those surveys that I mentioned of Western writers of America, and how a man called Horace would always come up as the best or one of the best short stories? Well, they also had a category in those surveys for who is the best Western writer of all time. And Elmer Kelton was number 1 every single time, as voted by his fellow Western writers. And a couple of his novels in particular, The Day the Cowboys Quit and The Time It Never Rained, would consistently show up in the top 5 best Western novels ever written, or at least the top 10. I've included in this montage on the lower right Bowie's Mine, which I wanted to specifically have this edition with this cover because it has a special meaning for me. This was the first grown-up book that I ever read when I was 8 years old, and I still vividly remember the opening of that novel. I always read way ahead of my age group, but this one has stuck with me. And something else that has stuck with me is something that Elmer Kelton said one time, that if you read his books, you will see how this plays out. He said, "I don't write about good guys in white hats fighting bad guys in black hats. I write about 2 guys in gray hats, one trying to institute change and the other resisting it," which says a lot about Kelton's characterization. The fact that his books always had a protagonist and an antagonist, and generally you could tell who the quote-unquote hero was and who the villain was, but the villain had depth. A lot of times that whole schematic there of one person trying to bring about change and the other resisting it, either one of those people could be the hero of a story, right? Heroically bringing change, or heroically trying to stick with how things were. And his works, even his sort of traditional westerns like Bowie's Mine, had a lot of complexity to them. The other book I have up here, The Good Old Boys, is, so far as I know, the only one of his books adapted into a film back in the 1990s with Tommy Lee Jones. And that is just a tragic shame, because Elmer Kelton really is, if not the best, one of the best Western writers of the 20th century. And his stories deserve to be read more widely, and he should be a household name, along with Louis L'Amour. Many people feel, that he's more deserving than Zane Grey or Louis L'Amour. Anyhow, Elmer Kelton, if you're not familiar with him, go out and get one of his books. I used the term traditional Western just now when I was talking about Elmer Kelton. The fact is, there are several different types of Western novels. Some are kind of the edges between them can get a little bit blurred, but I want to list some of these subgenres for you, and then go into a little detail with each of them to define what they are, because I think that there's an unfortunate tendency to lump everything all together. If it's a Western, it's a Western, but there are different kinds. So here are the kinds that we're going to talk about. The traditional Western, which I just mentioned, the literary Western, the historical Western, the Western romance, the adult Western, which does not just mean grown-up stories, the weird Western, let's not forget that one, and the contemporary Western. We're going to start with the aforementioned traditional Western, which is the type of Western that comes to the mind of most people, probably almost everybody, when they hear the term Western novel. Now, I have several examples that I'm going to show you, starting with the one over here on the far left, Redemption, Kansas by James Reasoner, which I liked well enough that I wrote the cover blurb for it. Also, we've got The Ghost with Blue Eyes by Robert J. Randisi, or Bob Randisi, which is maybe my very favorite traditional Western novel of all time. I highly recommend both of those. Several of these other folks on this image and the one that we're going to look at after this while I'm talking about traditional Westerns are folks you should probably look up. So what is a traditional Western? It's almost always set between right after the end of the Civil War until about 1900. So in other words, the era that we associate with, quote, the Wild West, the era of the cattle drives and free-range ranching, and then, several years after that through the 1890s, when, if you'll recall from our historical lectures, there were still things going on like the Johnson County War in Wyoming. There were things going on like the Wild Bunch and then the other Wild Bunch and so forth. So that time period, very much action oriented, with clear heroes and villains. Maybe not always necessarily sterling white hats and absolutely evil black hats, but you can easily tell who the hero is because they are heroic and the villain is villainous. They follow the standard themes we associate with the Wild West. Lawmen versus outlaws, fighting against Native Americans, cattle towns or mining towns, and things that develop in those sort of wide open towns, range wars, stories of revenge, and I just covered the plots of most Westerns right there. Also, just sort of the standard thing that we're used to associating with the Old West due to pop culture, like the showdown on the city streets, the town streets, the two guys drawing on each other in a duel, and various other things like that. So that is usually, almost always, what the traditional Western deals with. The storylines also usually follow a standard pattern. Some people would call it a formula. This is not true 100% of the time, but it's true most of the time. If you are a reader of this subgenre, which is, like I said, associated with the overall genre, you usually have a pretty good idea what you're going to be getting into when you pick one of these books up. And also, they're usually a fairly short read compared to some novels. Now, this is no longer universally the case as much as it once was because of, well, since the advent of the Kindle and print on demand, the length is no longer so predetermined. But for the longest time, throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s and into the 90s, for a long time, you could expect one of these novels to be about 150 to 200 pages. Maybe 250, usually not as many as 300. So if you're a writer and you think in these terms, usually like 50 or 60,000 words up to 80 or 90,000 words. Now, like I said, there are some outliers, but this is normally how it went. Now it's getting harder and harder to even find a Western section in a bookstore anymore. It wasn't even easy to find a picture of one online. I had to settle for this picture of a library Western section. Hey, that one's got one of mine in it. I did not realize that when I did the search for this image, by the way. Anyhow, it's just it's hard to find. And once upon a time, every bookstore had a Western section, and many grocery stores and department stores had book sections, and those book sections included a healthy section of traditional Westerns, your Krogers and your Walmarts and etc. Hard to find those in a bookstore now, unless it's a used bookstore, like this image that I found. But on the rare occasions when you do find a Western section with new books, not used ones, odds are you take a look at those shelves, more than half of those traditional Westerns, maybe as many as 2/3 of them, are all by these two guys, Louis L'Amour and William Johnstone. Now, we've already talked a bit about Louis L'Amour, but let's talk about Johnstone. He started writing in the 1970s, didn't really start getting published until the 80s, and really started to take off in the late 80s and early 90s, right after Louis L'Amour died, actually. And he was also heavily promoted by his publisher, and his books became ubiquitous. They were all over the place. All the way up until he passed away in 2004. And even after he passed away, the publisher kind of kept quiet about that for a couple of years until it was, leaked online, I think. And they had continued to have ghostwriters write under his name because, like with Louis L'Amour, it was the name that was drawing readers as much as the new title of whatever the new book was. He had become a brand in and of himself. Now, after 2006, I think it was, his niece, J.A. Johnstone, started writing a lot of, well, first finishing some of his manuscripts, I guess, and writing some books based on his characters, so that then you started seeing William Johnstone in huge letters with J.A. Johnstone in small letters. Nowadays, you can see J.A. Johnstone as the primary author in books. But it is not uncommon, like I said, to see Western sections dominated by, again, these are newly printed books by these two guys that have been passed away, that have shuffled off this mortal coil. 20 years ago in one case and almost 35 years ago in the other. Their titles are still in print. Now, Louis L'Amour wrote like 200 books. So, it's quite an accomplishment to get all of them. So, anyhow, it is also not uncommon to find readers who are absolutely devoted to these two authors in particular. to the extent that they pretty well stick with them, and there's such a large backlist of their books with new ones coming out that have their names attached to them. At least John Stone's The Situation I Described, Louis L'Amour. So far as I know, there have not been any, any ghost writers doing anything for Louis L'Amour. But what they do is take his many, many short stories and repackage them sometimes, and then re-release collections of short stories. That's not exactly the same as any other collection of short stories, but it's the same short stories. Anyway, I was at a book signing a few years ago in a used bookstore, and this older couple came in, and the wife said to her husband, "Hey, look, Charlie, that guy over there has Westerns. You like Westerns, you should get one." And he said, "No, I only read Louis L'Amour." Actually, he said Louis L'Amour, and William Johnstone, nobody else. So, I took that in stride. But it happened that I was sitting next to the used Western section that was similar to that shelf that we looked at just a moment ago. And there was an author who had several books on there that I knew had been the ghostwriter for, or at least I strongly suspected, for some of those William Johnstone things right after he'd passed away. So I told the husband, "Hey, if you like William Johnstone, I guarantee you'll like this guy. I guarantee it." But he wouldn't give it a try. Anyhow, the sales are slowly been drying up as sort of the generation of people who even know what a Western is starting to get smaller and older. Sometimes literally smaller as we get older, I guess. But there are new avenues opening up, especially through the venues I mentioned before, like online sales. Anyhow, that's the traditional Western. These are the guys that have dominated it for a pretty long time. But there's a whole lot of people. If you want to go back and look at some of those titles that I showed you, all of those people are worth looking up and reading, especially Elmer Kelton. Our next subgenre to examine is the literary Western. And under my list of things that define the literary Western, number one is they're hard to define. It's kind of hard to say exactly because a lot of the stuff that I would use to describe the literary Western applies to some of the other subgenres, in some ways to the traditional Western. It's kind of like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. But here are some general things. You'll notice I put sometimes in parentheses on a couple of these points. Often, a literary Western is going to be more complex in a lot of different ways. Complex plot-wise, complex character-wise than a traditional Western. But as I noted, not always. Some literary Westerns have pretty straightforward plots, and some traditional Westerns can get, fairly complex with characterization sometimes. Literary Westerns tend to be a longer read. I mentioned that the traditional Western, on the average, maybe 200 pages. You might have something that's 300. One of these literary Westerns could be 4 or 5 or even 600 pages long. But there are also literary Westerns that fit the description that are as short as a traditional Western. Often, here's one of the markers that is easier and I think more likely to differentiate. Often these are books by authors who are not known primarily as being Western authors. They are authors who have previously had novels published in other genres, or sometimes in no particular genre, who write a book that happens to be set in the West. It's not their milieu, if you will. Although in some cases it becomes that milieu as some of these people went on to write a lot more. And everyone on this page here, all these examples, these were not necessarily their first Western stories, but in many cases they were. So there's that. There's a more literary prose style. What does that even mean? It is way too easy to be condescending, I think, when you start using terms like this. The same thing happens in the mystery genre, in which some novels that are centered around crime are considered classics and highly elevated literature, and most of them are treated as though they were little better than trash. And the same thing tends to happen. But it is true that many of these books that qualify as literary westerns do have a different stylistic approach, more likely to have much more complex prose. Cormac McCarthy, for instance, if you've read his works, I love all these books. All these books are among my all-time favorites. McCarthy, though, I have to say, reads a lot more like William Faulkner than like Louis L'Amour. Let's just be honest. A lot of long sentences, sometimes getting creative with capitalization, stuff like that. Sometimes, when I said they're more complex plot and character-wise, but also sometimes in the use of language. Now, something else that happens sometimes in literary westerns is that the author tries to stay closer to the actual language of the time period being presented. Charles Portis did this in True Grit, and several other novels do it as well, so that the characters speak more like Victorian characters than like, movie stars in Hollywood movies. Also, here's one of the big ways to tell if something is a literary Western. Critics like it. If it is presented initially as a traditional Western and it deviates from that aforementioned formula in such a way that critics like it, all of a sudden it's not considered a traditional Western anymore. And sometimes, like I say, they're fairly or not. This is the case, because there are plenty of books that are written with literary, stylistic, some people would say pretensions, that actually are not that good when you read them. And there are plenty of traditional Westerns that are just outstanding. I would also say, in defense of people who write traditional Westerns, it is it's a craft that needs to be practiced. You need to develop some finely honed skills and have some pretty strong talents to be able to work within those conventions and be compelling. And some people are really, really good at that. A lot of it does come down to what the publisher wants the public to think about a book. Maybe the publisher wants to appeal to folks like that Charlie guy at the bookstore, and so they're going to frame things a certain way. And maybe they want to appeal to an audience that doesn't normally like Westerns, and maybe sometimes thinks that Westerns as a genre are below them. One way you can tell what the publisher's trying to do is to look at the cover designs, which the author, unless we're talking about something self-published, the author rarely has any input at all on cover designs. I've noticed that books that are being presented, and that were sometimes intentionally, often intentionally written to be traditional westerns, have action scenes on the front. In fact, almost famously, for years, there were artists who were employed by various New York publishers who were really good at doing paintings really quickly in a Western setting. And a lot of times those paintings on the cover had nothing to do with the story inside. It just conveys a feeling of action, and that's the audience that they want to bring in. Look at these books. In some cases, there's no image at all, or the image is very sort of serene. That's telling you that even though there may be action in these books, and there's a lot of action in all these books. Blood Meridian, an incredible amount of sometimes very disturbing action. The action is not the main point, right? The action is in service to the plot. So that's one way I think that you can look at these things. But like I said, you know it when you see it. And some of these are just outstanding, classic, wonderful books, and some of them aren't nearly as good as I think the authors themselves seem to think that they are, or the publishers. In that previous image, I had Lonesome Dove up there as an example of a literary Western. And the cover conveys a lot of the things that I was describing, right? So it's just a placid scene of some cowboys riding along with their cattle. It's mostly the text that's being highlighted, and they're pointing out that Larry McMurtry, when this book came out in 1985, the author of Terms of Endearment, that's what people were going to know him by, the fact that he had written that very famous novel, which became a famous movie. He also wrote The Last Picture Show, which I think qualifies as a contemporary Western and was outstanding. Lonesome Dove won the Pulitzer Prize, which is another way to tell if something is a traditional Western, because if it is a traditional Western, it's probably not going to win the Pulitzer Prize. But if it does, it will no longer ever be presented as if it were a traditional Western. Anyway, so Pulitzer Prize for that one. It was also the first novel in what would become a cycle of novels, all following the two main characters, or one of those two. Spoiler alert if you haven't read it or seen the TV miniseries. So 4 books written over a period of 12 years that were released, that were published and written, not necessarily in the order the story happened. So I have them laid out here chronologically by the setting. Dead Man's Walk examines the 2 Texas Ranger protagonists when they're like 20 years old. And then over the course of this series of books, you follow them through the rest of their lives. Like I said, McMurtry had written a lot of things set in, most of the things that he wrote were set in Texas, sometimes Wyoming, in various time periods from the 19th century to the 20th century. After the success of Lonesome Dove and this cycle of books, he wrote a lot of westerns after that. Some of them pretty good, some of them just kind of okay. But these are the cycle that I would say this cycle of 4 books is the 20th century equivalent to the Leatherstocking Tales that kicked off the Western genre, the frontier genre, back in the 19th century. By the way, this is a side point, but I've already referenced the fact that Lonesome Dove was made into a television miniseries, an outstanding one, one of the rare cases where the filmed version of a story equals the literary version of it. And the others were all filmed as well. And there was an extra one thrown in there immediately after Lonesome Dove, called Return to Lonesome Dove, that Larry McMurtry had nothing to do with and in fact disowned. So 5 miniseries, which means, well, the way it turned out, they had 5 different actors playing Woodrow Call, which makes it difficult to suspend your disbelief if you're, the sort of person that decides to watch them all together, which I've done a couple of times. I've also read all the books back to back, and it's a lot easier to do that because, you can have some consistency. I hope somebody's listening to me out there. I wish that HBO or Netflix or somebody, and I know this sounds like heresy, I wish they would remake all those miniseries into one big series and use the same actors throughout. That would be interesting to see. By the way, if you didn't know this, Lonesome Dove was originally, in the 1970s, conceived by Larry McMurtry as a screenplay, a story treatment for a screenplay that he wrote out, pretty detailed, that was going to star John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, and Henry Fonda. And they were all on board for it, but then John Wayne died. And it kind of fell apart. So he made it into a novel instead and went home with a Pulitzer Prize. Here's another of the all-time great literary Western authors who really did have a complex writing style and very complex characters. A.B. Guthrie Jr., who wrote a cycle of books, 6 books. In some cases, there were some characters that crossed over from one book to another, but it didn't necessarily follow the same people. It actually goes over the course of about a century. Starting with The Big Sky, which was published in 1947, followed by The Way West. I have The Way West smaller here than The Big Sky, and that's because it is. It's very good. In fact, it won a Pulitzer Prize. But it is The Big Sky that historians and critics and Western writers tend to put at the top as being Guthrie's masterpiece. And it also comes in those surveys near the top for the best Western novels ever written. Both of these, by the way, were made into films during the golden age of Hollywood, when they couldn't really deal with some of the issues that were in print versions of things, and they had to sanitize them quite a bit. Anyway, Guthrie not only won a Pulitzer Prize, he also he wrote the screenplay for the movie Shane, based on the Jack Schaefer novel, and got an Oscar nomination for that. In 1958, Oakley Hall, who wrote a lot of different types of novels. He did not confine himself only to Westerns. I almost said merely. There's no merely there. But it would become the first part of a trilogy that he would finish much, much later. It's an outstanding novel. It really takes the story of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, changes the names and the situations some, but you can tell that's what it's really kind of drawing from. And it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 1958. Walter Van Tilburg Clark of Reno, Nevada, wrote a novel that was published in 1940 called The Oxbow Incident that was, incredibly compelling. It was made into a film not long afterwards, starring Henry Fonda. It was the story of a lynch mob, essentially, and the compelling personal stories of both their victims and the members of this group of vigilantes. It was one of the best books written in the period, to be honest, Western or otherwise. And some people have referred to it as the first modern Western, not modern in its setting because it's set in 1885, but in the sense that it doesn't have any of the cliches or the formulas that were associated with Western novels already by this time in 1940. In 1972, Wallace Stegner won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel Angle of Repose, which is about a contemporary person in the Southwest who is working on a biography of his pioneer settler grandmother and going through her papers and trying to understand her life while also trying to understand his own life. And there's a lot of moving back and forth between the 19th and the 20th century. It's considered by many to be one of the best novels ever written about the West. Ivan Doig and Annie Proulx are two of the most celebrated literary writers of the last 30 or 40 years, and both of them have written pretty significantly about, although not exclusively, about the American West, mostly set in the 20th and into the 21st centuries. Doig's book English Creek in 1984 was the first of a whole series of novels set in Montana. Proulx's short story, actually she won the Pulitzer Prize in '93 for The Shipping News, which takes place in New York. But her short story, which was called Brokeback Mountain, that came out, I think, in 1998, won the O. Henry Prize for Best Short Fiction of the Year and was included in her collection of short stories all set in Wyoming in 1999. Of course, Brokeback Mountain was later made into a film, which had a screenplay adapted from Proulx's short story. Screenplay was written by Larry McMurtry, and he won an Oscar for that screenplay. For the first half of Cormac McCarthy's career, most of his novels were set in his native Tennessee. Then, starting in 1985, he took a westward turn with Blood Meridian, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been described by some as one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. It's set in along the Texas-Mexico border in the 1840s, and it deals with a group of scalp hunters who were, if you recall from our earlier discussions, people like Ike Glanton, who were making a living by collecting bounties off the scalps of Native Americans, mostly Apaches, but actually anybody who looked like they might be. And that was a very violent story. Then in the 90s, he wrote what has come to be called the Border Trilogy, with All the Pretty Horses coming out in 1992, then The Crossing in 94, and concluding with Cities of the Plain in 98. Those books are set in the 1940s and early 50s along the along the Mexican border in West Texas and New Mexico. And then in 2005, No Country for Old Men, set in Texas in 1980, which both the No Country for Old Men and the Border Trilogy have, well, they're historical in that they were set prior to the time in which they were published, but 20th century stuff compared to the 19th century Blood Meridian. I find it interesting that McCarthy and Larry McMurtry, who are probably the two names most closely associated with literary westerns in the late 20th century, both of whom became Pulitzer Prize winners, McCarthy in 2007 for his post-apocalyptic novel The Road, were writing these works at roughly the same time. The Lonesome Dove cycle and Blood Meridian and Cities of the Plain, which were incredibly different types of books and stories, but both out there at once. I'm going to close out this section about literary westerns by saying a brief word about one of the most, well, celebrated and revered American writers of the 20th century and indeed ever, John Steinbeck. And you probably haven't thought about John Steinbeck as a Western writer, certainly not as a genre, not traditional Westerns, but if you're familiar with his body of work, a good bit of it, a large amount of it, takes place in the American Southwest in the 20th century. But well, some of it revolves around ranch life, like The Red Pony, which you can't get much more contemporary at that time Western than that one if you've read it. And you also need to take into consideration that three of his novels that are often taken together as a trilogy, they're not directly related to one another except thematically, sometimes are called the Dust Bowl trilogy. And if you'll recall, we talked a lot about the Dust Bowl in the American West. And In Dubious Battle, Of Mice and Men, and The Grapes of Wrath all deal with that time period. They deal with migrant workers, every one of them. The Grapes of Wrath, of course, deals with those Okies who were forced to go farther west after their lands dried up in the Dust Bowl. And actually, any of these novels, if they came out today, if they came out in 2024, would be certainly worthy, and no question they'd be worthy, but they would be qualified to be considered as a contemporary Western novel. For example, the Contemporary Western Spur Awards, I would say. Our third subgenre is the historical Western, which may sound, you know, silly because aren't all Westerns set in history? Well, actually, no, not all of them are. But this denotes a different type of story than a traditional Western, even though those are set during a very specific time period. In many ways, the historical Western is in kind of an in-between place, sort of the missing link between traditional Westerns and literary Westerns, in that they also can be very complex and can be very long, in part because, not always, but often they cover long periods of time. Or it could just be going into really extraordinary detail in one particular short period of time. They can take place in the Wild West period, like much of Richard S. Wheeler's book about Bat Masterson, but they're not necessarily limited to that. They could be set during the fur trade, the mountain man period. They could be set during the colonial period. They could be set in the first half of the 20th century, that time period there between the Pancho Villa stuff that we talked about and World War II, during the Depression, the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. Could be set in the more recent past, but not contemporary. Otherwise, wouldn't be a historical Western, would it? So here are some examples, and you can see the same theme here. The imagery on the covers tells you what the publishers want you to get out of, or what to expect from these books. Not a whole lot of action. I couldn't find a picture of the first edition of Stone Song, which was a lot more static than this later edition, unless this may have been the. No, I don't think that this was the hardcover. Anyway, you've got Jory Sherman, who was also a nominee for the Pulitzer Prize during his career. Grass Kingdom, that's a great one. Stone Song by Win Blevins, about the life of Crazy Horse. Of course, Richard S. Wheeler's Masterson. He wrote a lot of other great books about the West, like Sierra, that's another good one, that really go into great detail and realistic detail about the lives of people at the time. Terry Johnston was famous for writing about the Mountain Man period. Douglas Jones wrote about a lot of different things in the West, a whole lot. But I think it's fair to say that you would probably not see a traditional Western called Gone the Dreams and Dancing. There's not enough there's not enough action in that title. Here's somebody who's difficult to categorize because on the one hand, James Michener was the master of the historical novel in general. He wrote historical novels with all kinds of settings. He wrote novels set in South Africa and Poland. He wrote a novel called Space about the space race. He also won the Pulitzer Prize for his short story, I think it was a short story collection, Songs of the South Pacific, which would become the basis of the musical South Pacific. But in particular, these three novels of his, which are like all of his novels, man, really long, because his stories span centuries sometimes. Very much Western novel, centennial, about the area that would become the town of Centennial, Colorado. Texas and Alaska more of a northwestern, but very, very good westerns that deal with cattle drives. They deal with, of course, the gold rush in Alaska. They deal with the blizzards of 1886 and 87, with the Dust Bowl, with various different things. I highly recommend them. And here is somebody that, unlike many of the people we've talked about so far, fortunately is still with us. Lucia St. Clair Robson. And kind of like Michener, she has written historical novels in a whole lot of different settings. She wrote one called The Hokkaido Road, I think, about Japan. But she's written several set in the frontier or the West, particularly Ride the Wind, which is the story of Cynthia Ann Parker, the mother of Quanah Parker. She is an outstanding historical novelist and a longtime active member of Western Writers of America. Judy Alter, another Spur Award winner, and also, fortunately, someone who's still with us. In my opinion, for my money, Judy Alter is one of the greatest, one of the best Western short story writers of all time. I think she ranks right up there with Dorothy Johnson. And here we have a married couple who are a writing team. They also write things separately, but as a team, they have written this series, this long-running series, starting in the early 1990s, that essentially covers different time periods in North America before the arrival of Europeans. Some of these stories spanning back thousands of years, some of them only a few hundred years. And here we have a married couple who are a writing team. They also write things separately, but as a team, they have written this series, this long-running series, starting in the early 1990s, that essentially covers different time periods in North America before the arrival of Europeans. Some of these stories spanning back thousands of years, some of them only a few hundred years. And by the way, so I guess you could call these works prehistorical westerns. By the way, both of the Gears are archaeologists, which certainly helps with this kind of subject matter. I'm including Glendon Swarthout in this category, even though his work really fits into probably several several categories that we have discussed. He has written, or he did write in his time period, in his career, in different genres. In fact, he wrote a novel in 1960 called Where the Boys Are. That was made into a very popular movie that was about college students going on spring break to Florida. But probably his most well-known work is The Shootist, which became the last film of John Wayne. They Came to Cordura, and The Homesman, which is, well, Lonesome Dove is my favorite literary Western. The Homesman is one of my favorite Westerns of any type. I love this novel. I love The Shootist, but I love The Homesman a little bit more. Anyhow, he was a New York Times bestseller, a Spur Award winner. His work probably could be fit into literary as well as historical, although he was not as sort of experimental with his prose, but in some ways he kind of was. Anyhow, read his books. They're darn good. Our next subgenre, Western romance, which, as the name implies, is a hybrid between Westerns and romance novels. Has a lot of the elements of the traditional Western, but follows the convention of romance novel, the romance genre. They're both a Western and a romance novel, but if you had to pick one, in most cases, they're more of a romance novel, I guess is one way that you could put it. Romance stories, popular with a lot of female readers for decades, were, for the longest time, kind of relegated to pulp magazines and other magazines that were devoted to that genre in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and even into the 1960s. It was only in the 70s that you started to have a whole literary genre so far as paperback books with Harlequin romance and their success, starting, I guess, before the 70s, maybe in the 60s, that made romance novels widely available. And that the same holds true for Western romances, that even during those time periods when romance stories were mostly in pulp fiction magazines, and there were also romance comic books, by the way, a genre created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, the guys that created Captain America. Ranch romances were a big thing in those pulp stories. So when I say they follow the conventions, there is kind of a formula that is generally followed and which readers expect when they pick up one of these books. So you've got, obviously, boy meets girl, right? The hero is a rugged, manly character. Often I've noticed on the covers to these, unable to afford buttons. The heroine is strong-willed and sassy. And the formula of the story, basically laid out, is they meet, they get separated, then they get reunited, and there's a happy ending. I've been told, and I don't know too much about this particular subgenre, to be honest, that most readers that follow these really feel comfortable with that formula and uncomfortable when it is deviated from. And I can understand that because there's a lot of genres that are like that. You know, the traditional Western in some ways is like that. If the formula gets deviated from significantly, all of a sudden it's not a traditional Western, it's something different. Same thing with mystery stories. A lot of times subgenres of mystery and crime stories, the readership expect certain beats in the story and get a certain amount of comfort, really, from being able to follow that like a puzzle. So if you've got a cozy mystery, which is a subgenre of mystery stories, if you've got a cozy mystery and you have um, the town busybody slash amateur sleuth in a closed room with all the people who may have committed the murder, which probably occurred before the story started. You don't then have the hard-nosed detective walk in and slap everybody around and shoot two or three people, because then it's not a cozy mystery anymore. So I can see that. However, I'm not going to do the same thing with this subgenre that I did with the others. I'm not going to try to tell you who some of the more significant writers and some of the more significant works have been, because I'm just not familiar enough with it. Now, I do have a lot of friends who write in this subgenre, but I'm not entirely sure, like where they fit within the framework of that. So I'll just move on to the next one, and that is the adult western, which I confess I am more familiar with. The adult western. Now, when you use the term adult western and you're talking about western movies, that means something totally different than it does when you're talking about western fiction, western literature. Adult western in the movie sense of the word is when they started making more complex western movies that were not geared at 10-year-old kids, but were a little more sophisticated. In this case, though, adult westerns in the western literature category means, yeah, if you're not an adult, you're not supposed to be reading this stuff. It's got a lot of sex and violence in it. Kind of reached its heyday was the 1970s and 80s. Still pretty big in the 90s. 21st century slowed down significantly because the sales of paperback books slowed down significantly. And then finally, several of the New York publishers that still produce these things canceled them. I think there were a bunch of them canceled in 2015, but some of them have lived on in an online print-on-demand incarnation from smaller publishers. So, the adult Western basically is a traditional Western, follows all the conventions of traditional Westerns, except, if anything, even more action-oriented. And that action can include very graphic violence sometimes, and there's sex, by which I mean extremely graphic sex. In one of these books, in any of these series, odds are probably going to have 2 or 3 scenes in there of a graphically described movement by movement sexual encounter that could run several pages, or so they tell me. Often, in most cases, actually, these series, which would come out, there'd be a new book out every month or so. They would be published under a house name. What does that mean? That means that the author of this series is not a real person. A name would be chosen to be the author, and then they would hire a bunch of people to be that author, because they'd have to, because one person could not produce books this quickly usually. So Tabor Evans, Jake Logan, these were not actual people. There's a famous story that I've heard many times, told by many people, some of whom were there, about a Western Writers of America conference one time. And I don't know when this was. It may have been in the late 70s or 80s. But at the bar, at the conference venue after the sessions were over, a bunch of writers were hanging out around the table having drinks. And somebody walked in that was a brand new member. It was their first convention. And they came up to the table and introduced themselves and said, "But you might know me by my pseudonym. I'm Jake Logan." And everybody at the table just stared at him. And somebody said, "Everyone at this table, son, is Jake Logan." Anyhow, these westerns were looked down on by a lot of Western writers, but they also paid the bills for a lot of Western writers, gave them an opportunity to keep steady work going, and they sold. They sold really well in the 1970s and 80s. In a lot of ways, these stories were, in addition to being traditional Western themed, they also were playing off of the anti-hero in spaghetti westerns, which were popular around the time that these books started coming out. Right, the amoral character who doesn't necessarily, wear that white hat in the same sense that the Lone Ranger did, and doesn't necessarily have that sense of fair play and decency and give me a glass of milk, One of the most, I think, one of the best examples of a writer and a series associated with this subgenre, although some of the best Western writers in the business wrote under these various pseudonyms for these books. But there was, in particular, a guy named George Gilman, who was from Great Britain. He was English. His name wasn't actually George Gilman. It was Terry Harknett. George Gilman was one of many pseudonyms that he used. And he created a series in 1972 called Edge that was not just a really good example of adult westerns, but it was really what got the ball rolling with the whole subgenre. And they were promoted from the beginning as being very violent. Within a few books in, on the cover, it was saying the most violent Western published today, and by golly, it was. Also, lots of sex, but usually not hinted at so much on the cover. It was the action that was focused on. The storyline, such as it was, is that this guy known as Edge, Josiah Hedges, I think was supposed to be his real name. He was a Union captain, I think, in the Civil War, who in his squad of men had a bunch of just low-down, scummy, violent, brutal thugs that he had to ride herd on throughout the war to keep them from committing various war crimes, sometimes unsuccessfully. And they resented him for it. And so when the war was over, a bunch of them beat him back to his ranch and killed his family quite viciously. And so now he's a bounty hunter. That's how he's making his living. But on the side, he's hunting down all these former men under his command. And he carries a razor blade and a pouch around his neck and a Bowie knife, and is very, very violent. And Harknett was, in fact, one of 4 English authors who knew one another in London, who initially basically got together and planned out making this change to the Western genre by incorporating some of the stuff from the spaghetti westerns, also from the men's adventure series of novels that were popular at the time in the late 60s and early 70s, The Destroyer and The Executioner. And so each of these four guys, initially it was these four, um, each had three or four pseudonyms that they wrote under. And between the four of them, they had a bunch of these hyper violent adult Western series in the early 70s. Angus Wells, Lawrence James, and John Harvey being the others. Gilman wrote Edge and also The Undertaker and also Adam Steele. And the publishers, when they saw how successful these books were and how much money they were making, that's when they decided, hey, let's just go all out and start having some more series. And so a lot of American writers then got in on the action, and that's when these other series that we talked about started. That really heavily promoted on their covers, if you'll recall from just a few minutes ago, the sexual encounters that were going to be described in the book. The sexual encounters in these books, these four guys were called the Piccadilly Cowboys, by the way. Um, in the books by people like Harknett, even the sex was different from what it would later be in those adult series. Because if you'll go back and look at the covers from those Long Arms and Jake Logan's, you can tell that everything is at least somewhat romantic and consensual. These books had sex. The ones like Edge, they had sex, they had violence, they had violent sex, and everything was just kind of disturbing. But a lot of people liked it, and as I said, I confess, I really enjoyed the Edge series at the time, although I've gone back to reread them, and just doesn't quite hit me the same later in life. Now let's talk about weird westerns, which is also a hybrid in which the Western genre gets blended with horror, science fiction, or fantasy, sometimes steampunk, which is various elements of all those things, sometimes. And it's been around for as long as Westerns have been published, really. Um, this first example that I have on here by Charles Finney, The Circus of Dr. Lao, came out in 1935, and it's set in an old west town in Arizona. And this traveling circus comes into town that is led by this Chinese guy who's kind of a sorcerer, really, and things get really, really weird. 30 years later, there was a movie version of this. So, for the most part, though, weird westerns that's not something that you saw in novels as much. You saw it in short stories sometimes. There were some movies like Billy the Kid Meets Dracula, like the one movie where, what was it, the Valley of the Guanji, I think it was called, where there was dinosaurs and cowboys. And in comic books. You started to see it in book-length fiction more often in the mid 80s with Joe R. Lansdale's classic Dead in the West. Lansdale, a Texas native, has been one of the brightest luminaries in writing weird westerns. He also writes just regular westerns, and he also writes crime stories and horror. He really is an awesome writer. He's one of my favorites. So today in the 21st century, it's pretty common to find examples of weird westerns in novels. You don't have to, dig so deeply to find them. In fact, we'll talk more about this when I talk about comic books in a few minutes. But weird westerns are more common than regular westerns in the 21st century. I think you could fairly say that a lot of elements of Stephen King's Dark Tower series um, has a very strong weird Western vibe, particularly with the main character known as the Gunslinger. While weird westerns might have been around since at least the 1930s, not only with that Circus of Dr. Lau, but some of Robert E. Howard's short stories kind of merged western with horror and fantasy. But the term weird western really came about with the comic book that started in 1972 from DC Comics, which at that time, this is kind of a unique set of situations. The Comics Code Authority had clamped down on horror comics back in the early 50s, and in the early 70s they loosened that lid a little bit, and so there were all kinds of ghost and terror things being published in comic book form. There were weird war tales, and there were weird Western tales. And I'll be talking more about this again when we talk about comic books in just a few minutes. Our final subgenre, the contemporary Western, which is just what it sounds like, a Western but contemporary, set in the modern time or the present day, in the present day of the time in which it is written. So you could have a book that was written in the 1950s or 1960s, like, for example, The Rounders by Max Evans, that was set in that time period that may seem more historical now when you read it, but it wasn't intended to be at the time. Usually set in the geographic West, although not necessarily always. Like I said, we talked about Justified. It's set mostly in Kentucky, but there's a very strong cowboy and Western culture element to it. So it is often counted as a contemporary Western. But there has to be some kind of connection to Western culture and cowboy life. So Max Evans, a couple of his most famous works about ranchers in the and ranch workers in the 20th century, The Rounders and the High-Low Country, both of which were made into movies. Also, a couple of examples include the mystery novels by Craig Johnson with the hero Sheriff Walt Longmire, which was a TV series for several years set in modern-day Wyoming, and the mystery novels by Tony Hillerman that are set on the Navajo reservation in the modern day, in the times in which they were written. Those started coming out in the early 1970s. But like I said, these categories all sometimes can kind of blend together, and there are some writers who write across subgenres, or who write in such a way that it's really hard to nail them down into a specific subgenre. And here are some examples that I immediately think of when I think about that. All of them Spur Award winners. Ed Gorman passed away a few years ago, sadly. I love his work. He's like a lot of Western writers are also crime or mystery writers, like Elmore Leonard and also Bob Randisi that we mentioned earlier, Lauren Estelman that we're going to talk about in a second, and Ed Gorman, Joe R. Lansdale. There's a lot of crossover potential because with the particularly the subgenres of hard-boiled detective and cowboy, there's that rugged individualism, one guy against against everybody kind of thing. Anyway, Ed Gorman wrote some Western novels that were traditional Western length and traditional Western sort of settings, but often had a twist to them, a lot of complexity, a lot of darkness in a lot of his stories, by which I mean psychological darkness. Johnny Boggs has written a whole lot of Westerns, and he actually he broke Elmer Kelton's record and as of this moment now has a record-winning 9 Spur Awards. But his books, you could look at them as traditional westerns. You could look at them as historical westerns. You could look at the works of all 4 of these guys as literary westerns to some degree. They're just not easily pigeonholed. John Nesbitt also just I love the work of all 4 of these guys. John Nesbitt has written a lot of westerns that could qualify as traditional westerns, but have a very strong literary western element to them. He's won 4 Spur Awards. Lauren Estelman has won 5 as of this year, 2024. Estelman also written a lot of things that qualify as traditional westerns, but have an extraordinary amount of depth sometimes, and also sometimes very historically oriented. Bloody Season is one of the best fictional works, in my opinion, about Wyatt Earp and Tombstone, Arizona. So I feel like I had to lay out these subgenres and these categories because they exist and because people use the terms, and I wanted to explain a little bit about what they are, but at the same time I don't want to be restricted or inhibited by them or pigeonholed because writers, when you come down to it, writers are writers, and they write stories and tell the stories that they want to tell in the ways that they want to tell them. And some of them may hit a certain segment of the population in one way, and some might not. But anyhow, those are the categories. Speaking of labeling, I want to talk for a moment about what I like to think of as westerns from unexpected places, which are western novels from authors that are not traditionally associated with western novels, who demonstrate that you can't always box someone in. So let's start by talking about Robert B. Parker, who had a very long and productive career as a crime novelist slash mystery novelist slash detective novelist, most famously for his 2 long-running series, Spencer for Hire and Jesse Stone. Parker was in his 70s when he published his first Western novel, Appaloosa, which was a traditional Western. Hit all the right beats, and as I've discussed before, there's a lot of similarities between the traditional cowboy hero and the traditional detective, particularly the hard-boiled detective or noir detective. However, unlike some of the other people we've talked about, like, for example, Elmore Leonard, Lauren Estelman, Bob Randisi, and others, who pretty much have always alternated back and forth between westerns and crime novels, Parker just was known for crime novels until late in his life, and this western of his was a New York Times bestseller, which didn't hurt that his name was on it and his name was very well known. But he followed that up in the next few years with 3 more novels in the series featuring the same characters. Richard Matheson, on the other hand, had written some westerns early in his career in the 1950s, short stories for the most part that were published in magazines primarily, but that's not what he was known for. In fact, most people would not have had any idea that he had ever published anything in the Western genre, because starting in the mid-1950s and for the next several decades, Richard Matheson wrote some of the all-time greatest horror, science fiction, and fantasy novels. Just take a moment and look at these titles. I'm pretty sure you'll recognize at least some of them. I like to describe Richard Matheson as the greatest writer that the average person has never heard of. Now, fans know Richard Matheson, but he's not a household name, and he should be, because, again, look at the impact that he's had on those genres. And then, if you go beyond just the printed word, he also has had a big impact on screen, not just in movie adaptations of his novels, but in screenplays that he has written. For example, The Devil Rides Out, which many people consider maybe the best of the Hammer horror films starring Christopher Lee, and also the movie Duel, which was based on one of his short stories about a traveler in the Southwest in the modern era, played by Dennis Weaver from Gunsmoke and McCloud, who's being pursued for no apparent reason by a psychopathic maniac in a semi. And this was the first feature film directed by Steven Spielberg. On the small screen, Matheson has contributed some of the most noteworthy things in the horror genre on television, including creating one of my favorite characters, Carl Kolchak, in The Night Stalker, which initially was a couple of TV movies that he wrote the screenplays for. Also wrote some of the most memorable episodes of The Twilight Zone, including that one where William Shatner sees a gremlin on the airplane wing. In 1992, Richard Matheson published a traditional Western, Journal of the Gun Years, and this was sold along with the traditional Westerns at the time on book racks, and it won the Spur Award that year for the best Western novel. And he followed it up over the next few years with a couple more Western novels and a collection there in the lower right of those 1950s Western stories of his. So made a big impact in a short time in this genre that he had never really been associated with. And I can tell you, don't take my word for it, go read them. But Journal of the Gun Years in particular is one of the best traditional Westerns, in my opinion, ever written. One more example I'd like to share with you. Howard Weinstein, who wrote when he was 19 years old in 1974. He wrote the script for an episode of Star Trek, the animated series, The Pirates of Orion. And for the next 40 years, on into the present, so 50 years, I guess you could say now, for the next several decades, he was associated closely with Star Trek, having written many Star Trek novels, as well as comic books and graphic novels, and also being a story consultant on the film Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, the one with the whales. So some other science fiction things that he wrote. Star Trek, though, is where he was mostly associated by the public. But then, 2017, I believe it was, he released his first Western novel, Galloway's Gamble, which won the Peacemaker Award for Best Traditional Western Novel that year. Followed it up with a sequel not long after, and since then he's been showing up in Western short story anthologies fairly regularly. So never too late to show your Western roots, or grow some if you didn't have them, I suppose. Now that we have looked at and identified all these different subgenres, let's briefly talk about where they are now. And the traditional Western is, on the one hand, not in the healthiest space. you don't see nearly as many, I mean, not a fraction as many westerns on the stands as you did even 25, 30 years ago. On the other hand, people have been proclaiming the death of the western since the advent of the western, and it never quite dies out, never quite goes away. Nonetheless, can't deny that most of the major New York publishers have have canceled their Western lines that in some cases they had had going for many decades. However, sometimes when the door closes, you find a window, and particularly with the advent of print on demand and the Kindle and the ebook, there are lots and lots of westerns available out there. Some of them, self-published by people who are new to the profession and to the genre, but in some cases, people who have been at it for decades have found that either publishing things themselves or going through small publishers that are based primarily online are more successful for them than holding on to hope from those New York publishers. And there have been some small publishers that have shown up on the scene, specializing in traditional westerns, such as Wolfpack Publishing, that I think started in 2013. They're producing a lot of stuff by veteran Western novelists and newcomers to the genre. So there's plenty of stuff out there to find. With the literary and historical subgenres, you're still seeing titles that are set in the West showing up from major New York publishers, sometimes hitting the bestseller lists. You see them showing up from a lot of university presses, which might not hit the bestseller lists, but which nonetheless get sometimes get attention. And some of these have made a splash, kind of the way that Thomas Berger and Charles Portis did back in the 60s. Some of these have already been adapted into films and TV series. Some of them, well, a lot of them actually, are what some people would refer to as revisionist, which, as a historian, let me just tell you that the expression revisionist history is a misnomer, and it is redundant, because all history is revised every time it's told. You know, how many books have been written about Abraham Lincoln? How many books have been written about George Armstrong Custer? Thousands and thousands, and yet there are more. And each new one takes a slightly different perspective and looks at things from a slightly different angle than the ones before. That's natural and normal in the historical profession. So what some people refer to as revisionist westerns, what they're really meaning is westerns that do not hew very specifically to the formulas and the genre tropes of the past, or perhaps the historical misconceptions of the past, or that look at and again, think back to all that discussion that we had about Frederick Jackson Turner and the Frontier thesis, that look at other groups rather than just the majority group, especially when we're talking about westward expansion, westward movement, the Euro-American settlers, often male, that are featured in older Western stories, usually. And by the way, even in traditional Westerns, there are plenty of different perspectives available, now more so than ever. But here among these historical or literary ventures of recent years, you can see voices, both within the writers themselves and the topics and characters they write about, reflecting the Latinx perspective, the African American perspective, the LGBTQ perspective, the Asian American perspective. And there's been quite a few in recent years, quite a few new voices from indigenous authors, kind of following in the tradition of prominent indigenous authors of the recent past, like Louise Erdrich, for example. They're still out there. They're being heard, and a lot of times, I think the people that buy these are and read them and appreciate them, oftentimes don't even realize they're reading a Western. You know, if it's set in the West, if it's set in the historical West, particularly, even if the sensibilities are a little bit different than a Louis L'Amour novel, or maybe a lot different, it's still essentially still it's a Western. It's just a different kind. I wanted to also mention, while we're talking about authors, Western authors, and particularly since I've mentioned Western writers of America several times, a couple of Native American authors, of the many that are or have been members of Western Writers of America, a couple that we've lost in the last few years. N. Scott Momaday, who was Kiowa and won the Pulitzer Prize, the first Native American to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction with House Made of Dawn. And also Robert Conley, who was a member of the United Kituwa Band of Cherokees, who wrote a lot of traditional westerns. Some of his traditional westerns had Cherokee protagonists, or in some cases Choctaw or Creek protagonists, but not all of them. Both these individuals were luminaries in their field. Momaday, a luminary in the field of American literature of the 20th century period. And both of them were active members of Western Writers of America. I want to talk for a moment about some writers' organizations and the awards that that they give out that are associated with the Western genre. Of course, the big one is Western Writers of America. That was established in 1953. And they give the Spur Awards for outstanding literature about the American West every year since 1953. The number of categories has expanded since the organization's founding. It's not specifically just about Western fiction. Western Writers of America is not. It's about Western writing. So there are members and award categories, not just for Western fiction, but for nonfiction and poetry and screenplays and children's books and Western-themed music. Even within those categories, there are subdivisions. Western Writers of America, for example, in the fiction awards, they've got, and it kind of has changed over time, and sometimes it sort of varies from year to year. But there's always a Best Short Fiction award. The novel awards are, I think at this moment, you've got the best original, best paperback original. There's a best mass market paperback. There's a best novel of the West, which really is dealing with historical Western novels. There's a best contemporary Western category. And, you know, in nonfiction, they've got the best biography. They've got the best history book that takes place, I think the division might be pre-1900 and post-1900, two different awards. I'm wrong, I'm sure, on the exact years there. But the cool thing, I started to say the interesting, it's interesting and it's cool, is that there's all these categories because, as we've just discussed, there's a lot of different kinds of westerns, fiction and nonfiction, and those other things. And so it's hard to lump them all in together. But the important thing is that the categories are all Spur Award categories. So if you win a Spur Award for best mass market paperback, or if someone else wins a Spur Award for best novel of the West, and someone else for the best contemporary Western, you are all Spur Award winners, right? You all have that honor and distinction. There's also the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, which is in Oklahoma City. And man, if you haven't been there, you need to plan a trip. They've got so much awesome stuff, in addition to what you would normally expect to find in a museum, which is to say historical artifacts, material culture, and so forth. A lot of paintings that are related to the American West. Also, a lot of pop culture stuff. Man, you can go over there and you can see Matt Dillon's hat and Doc Adams's shingle that hung outside his office on Gunsmoke, and Paladin's gun holster and one of Miss Kitty's dresses. It's cool. They give out an award called the Wrangler Award, which is this statue on the far right, in several different categories, not nearly as many categories as the Western Writers of America. And there's also the Western Fictioneers, established in 2010 by a bunch of Western writers who were, in some cases, a little frustrated that the traditional Western was being sort of swept aside, even, within the general public and general perception, and from the point of view of some of these writers in Western Writers of America. So they decided to form an organization that specifically deals with traditional Westerns, and closely connected in some ways with Western Writers of America, in that many members are in both things. But the awards they give out, the Peacemaker Award, which is a best novel and a best short story, and I think a best children's story, and a Lifetime Achievement Award, which Western Writers of America also has. Nothing about nonfiction, because this is Western Fictioneers. I was honored and lucky and blessed to have been one of the individuals at the Western Writers of America conference in Knoxville in 2010, who got together after having discussed all this online on our writers sort of thread that we had by email, and officially formed this organization and laid out the initial rules for the awards and stuff. And I was the second president of it for 2 years, from 2012 to 2014. Well, let's talk a little bit about Western comics. Westerns have been a part of comic books from the very beginning of comic books. And in the late 1940s and throughout the 50s, Westerns dominated the newsstands and spinner racks in the comic book sections, the way that Western series dominated television. Of course, before there were comic strips. And this was the first fully Western-themed regular comic strip. Came out in 1928, initially called Young Buffalo Bill, then later Bronco Bill. And there were more to follow, like Red Ryder, which was a pretty popular strip that inspired a series of movies, and eventually a BB gun, and then eventually a Christmas movie. But we'll talk about all that in more detail when I get to the Western films section. However, this is something a lot of folks don't know. Red Ryder actually started as a comic strip. And here's our friend Zane Grey. I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Zane Grey, but he had his own comic strip for a while that he scripted. So keeping his name out there at a time period when in the 1930s, with the Depression hitting, even Zane Grey could have used a little extra money and exposure. And then in 1933 came the arrival of the comic book. The first one, it was a brainchild of Max Gaines, who would be an extremely important figure in comic books for years to come, as would his son, William Gaines. Was initially basically a bunch of recycled comic strips. So they had previously published comic strips that they got the rights to collect into a single magazine. And there were several imitators of the first one, Famous Funnies. But when they were imitators, they were genuinely imitating in the sense that those first couple of years, all the new comic book titles that started to slowly spring up followed the same pattern of essentially reprinting previously published newspaper comic strips. But that changed in 1935. And it changed with the advent of this comic book, New Fun magazine, later renamed after a few issues to More Fun, which was the very first comic book to be comprised completely of brand new stories, new material. And you will notice that the featured storyline from the very first issue was Jack Woods, Texas Ranger, who is operating as a Texas Ranger during the time of what we discussed earlier, the Bandit Wars and the Mexican Revolution, and Pancho Villa, who winds up being the running villain in this storyline. New Fun magazine was the brainchild of an Army veteran named Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, who had actually been in the cavalry during that time period, the one that we discussed a couple of lectures back about, the John Blackjack Pershing leading the cavalry into the border and into Mexico to pursue Pancho Villa. Anyway, very first comic book with new material, part of that new material was a Western, and that's what got highlighted on the front cover. By 1937, you were seeing comic book titles whose entire theme was Western stories. Anthology titles for the most part, but everything between the covers of these comics was a Western. And over on the left, I highlight there with an exclamation point the fact that Western Picture Stories featured work by Will Eisner, a writer and artist who did the cover there. Will Eisner, if you don't know, is kind of like the Owen Wister of comic books, in that he was a huge figure in the early years of the comic book medium and industry, and in that the awards for comic book excellence for writers and artists and titles and so forth are called the Eisner Awards. So, Westerns plugging along, and of course also still appearing in the regular anthology comic books, like a new comic that started in 1938, Jumbo Comics, which featured a recurring strip called Wilton of the West by a young artist named Jacob Kurtzberg, who used the pen name Fred Sand or Sandy for his Wilton of the West series. But later that year, of 1938. He was also working on the Lightning and Lone Rider series over in Famous Funnies under a different pen name now, Lance Kirby. Sometime between 1939 or around 1939-1940, he would finally settle on a pen name, a professional name, Jack Kirby. Then, in early 1941, with his new writing partner, Joe Simon, March 1941, the two of them created an obscure superhero named Captain America. Speaking of Captain America, 1939, a couple of years, year and a half before the Captain America creation, the first issue of Marvel Comics, which featured several brand new characters like the Human Torch, who had the cover story, Prince Namor, the Submariner, and the Masked Raider, a Western strip. So Westerns were a part of comic books from the beginning. They were part of Marvel Comics from the very beginning. Now, throughout the 1940s, there were a few Westerns here and there. They didn't take the industry or the newsstands by storm, although there were plenty of examples. But primarily during the World War II years, most comic books were superheroes or military, war-themed comic books. That changed after the war. And in fact, around 1948, the floodgates opened and Western comics just became hugely popular. And publishers cashed in on this by putting out as many Westerns as they could. So this was kind of the heyday of Westerns, the Western genre, in the comic book medium. Around that same time, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon co-created another, well, not just a comic book, but a whole genre of itself, the romance comic, which, romance magazines were popular with young ladies, and trying to kind of cash in on that opportunity. Simon and Kirby thought, hey, we could probably get some girls buying our comic books if we had some storylines that appealed to them more. Although in reality, plenty of girls were already reading the regular types of comic books. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about different genres of Western fiction, romance comics included a whole subgenre of Western romance. And Simon and Kirby together produced, not necessarily these, but a lot of Western comic romances. Then in 1950, Simon and Kirby launched what many critics, historians, and fans consider to be among the very best Western comics ever made, a title called Boys Ranch. It was not an anthology title. It followed the same characters from issue to issue. A group of orphan teenagers that were kind of supervised by a scout named Clay Duncan, who had inherited the boy orphans had inherited a ranch. And this was the time period when Jack Kirby, the artist, really started coming into his own and developing the style that he would be known for a decade later. You can see in this splash page, which there were a lot of splash pages in this book, the dynamic nature of Kirby's artwork, dynamic and detailed. This comic book only lasted a few issues before it was canceled, but it is, ironically, having run much shorter a length of time than many comic books that have been completely forgotten. It is very well remembered still today. Marvel Comics, known as Timely actually in the 40s and Atlas in the 50s, would develop a whole stable of Western heroes, Western characters, starting in 1948, that would continue to be on the newsstands, in some cases all the way up to the late 1970s. Characters like the like Kid Colt, he was probably one of their biggest ones. The Ringo Kid, later Ghost Rider, sometimes later called Knight Rider or Phantom Rider. And in the early 60s, a couple of the Western characters, the Two Gun Kid and the Rawhide Kid, were drastically changed in appearance and backstory when Jack Kirby was brought in to revitalize them and revamp them a bit. And that kind of gave them the energy to keep going with a whole new set of fans in the 60s. Late 60s, early 70s, there was even the introduction of the Native American character Red Wolf. Another of the Marvel characters, before it was called Marvel, was Black Rider. And here is a photo cover of one of the issues of Black Rider. You know, a lot of comic books, Western comics, were based on famous actors who starred in Westerns, and so they would have their photograph on the cover. Black Rider wasn't a real person or played by a real person, so they had to have someone dress up like the character. And by the way, that character was being drawn by Jack Kirby, among others. And so the editor at Marvel, editor and head writer, stepped in and put on the Black Rider outfit. A young fellow that you may know, Stan Lee. By the way, back in 1996, 1 year after I had had my first published fiction and Western fiction, and I had started writing nonfiction Western articles for history magazines, and I had 2 or 3 of those in the pipeline. I heard that Stan Lee was going to be making an appearance at The Great Escape in Nashville, which is about 2 hours from where I'm from. And I called up one of my editors and I said, "Hey, Stan Lee's going to be in Nashville, and I bet no one ever asks him about his Western comics. And I bet if I could say that I was working on an article for your magazine, I could get an interview with him." So took the family to Nashville and stood in line to meet Stan Lee. And I got his autograph on a copy of Two Gun Kid number 60, which was the first appearance of the redesigned, retooled Two Gun Kid by Jack Kirby. And he signed that and he said, "Oh, I remember when Jack drew this." So I was able to set up, in fact, an appointment for an interview. He put me in touch with his publicist, for it to be official. And so called there, and I was able to do an interview, have a couple of conversations on the telephone with him after that. And it was the coolest thing because, he was in his office in Hollywood, and I was in my trailer back in the woods, And I said, "You probably don't remember me from The Great Escape in Nashville." And he said, "Oh yeah, you're Two Gun," and he referred to me as Two Gun the whole time through the whole 2 interviews. Anyway, there is a reprint of that on my website. It should be easy to find if you want to read the whole thing, because we did talk about the Western genre in general and his contributions to it. And by the way, my kid's going to be 33 soon, but they still show friends this picture of us with Stan Lee. Lee and Kirby and a handful of others would go on to create most of the characters that make up the Marvel Universe, or at least the foundations of it in the early to mid 1960s, and also brought back the Simon Kirby creation Captain America. But at the same time, Lee and Kirby and others, including Dick Ayers, were working on those revamped, newly updated, new image Two Gun Kid and Rawhide Kid comics, as well as the old Kid Colt and others. And Marvel has continued to occasionally go back and revisit their Western characters from time to time, and you know, into the 21st century every once in a while. Meanwhile, Marvel's principal rival, DC, which gets its name, by the way, from another Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson creation, Detective Comics. Well, DC had their own Western comics and Western heroes throughout the 1950s and 60s, and again into the early 70s. But by the late 60s and early 70s, there was a slightly different approach being taken by DC toward the Western story. Several new characters and titles were introduced that sort of diverged from the way things had previously been, including there on the right character that came along in the late 1960s, Bat Lash, short for Bartholomew Lash, a gambler who had a personality that was very similar to that of Brett Maverick from the TV show Maverick, except maybe more so. Also, there was a character called Scalp Hunter, who was a Kiowa Kiowa warrior slash bounty hunter, who was following the long tradition of Native Americans who were actually white people who had been raised as Native Americans. And in 1972, you saw the introduction of the previously mentioned Weird Western Tales, who focused on a lot of different characters. That's where Scalp Hunter debuted. There in the example that we have in the middle, El Diablo, a Latino masked Western hero character. But the one that sort of really took off from Weird Western Tales and came to dominate the title until he got his own title was Jonah Hex, who, for my money, is the greatest Western comic book character ever. Notwithstanding the movie that came out, if you saw that, I'm sorry. Although Josh Brolin was perfect for the role. Anyhow, they messed around a little too much with the character, I think is what happened there. Jonah Hex, a bounty hunter, very strongly modeled on the spaghetti western sort of amoral gunfighter characters from film in the 1960s and 70s. Kind of like those adult westerns of the early ones by the Piccadilly Cowboys were. And really a popular character. In fact, Western comics started to die out in the late 1970s, and most of them were canceled by 1978, including the long-running Two Gun Kid, which had been running since about 1948 or 49, I believe. Rawhide Kid, all of them really, except Jonah Hex. Jonah Hex is the one that managed to survive that purge, which I think a lot of that purge had to do with the fact that 1977 is when Star Wars came out. And having been a kid at the time, I was 9 in 77, I can tell you that Star Wars is all kids were thinking about. So the Western kind of went by the wayside. Even Jonah Hex by about 1983 or 84. And there was a very dry period in comic books for Western characters in the 1980s, as there also was in film. But just like with the film, they started making a comeback in the 90s. And that included, by the 2000s, Jonah Hex having his own title again, several others being brought back, including Batlash. I think this was 2008, in which you had this miniseries that was illustrated by two of the greatest comics artists of all time, Sergio Aragones and John Severin, and was scripted by a newcomer to the comics medium, Peter Brandvold. But that name should be familiar to you because he was one of those popular and successful traditional Western authors in the late 90s and into the 21st century. And here we have several of those long-standing characters who made a 21st century comeback, including the horribly facially scarred Jonah Hex. By the way, a couple of noteworthy characters that showed up in the Western comics genre in the 1960s and 70s. We'll start with a more recent one from the 1970s there on the right, Reno Jones. So the comic book was initially called Reno Jones and Kid Cassidy, the Gunhawks. But after a few issues, Kid Cassidy got killed off, and then it became just Reno Jones, Gunhawk, which was kind of a rare thing in the 1970s to have an African American as the lead, as the main character in a Western comic. But it wasn't the first time it had happened. First time it happened was about a decade earlier in the 60s from Dell Comics, which was an extraordinarily successful company, created a character called Lobo, who was an Army veteran who's now wandering the West while being pursued by the law for a crime he didn't commit. And none of this, plot-wise, necessitates him being African American. That's one of the cool things about it. He was kind of a standard traditional Western hero who just happened to be a black guy. However, there was a problem. This was during the time that segregation was still around in the South, and a lot of Southern distributors refused to even distribute this comic book, and it was canceled after just a few issues. But it was very significant in that Lobo was the very first African American character to have his own comic book title from a major comics company. Meanwhile, Westerns had caught on in comic book format outside the United States. The concept traveled around the world to Latin America, to Europe. There were several, I mean a whole lot of comic titles from those other countries. In particular, El Teniente Negro, the Black Lieutenant. And then here are some other examples. Just as Western movies were being made in Italy and Spain, Western comics were a big hit, although sometimes with slightly different sensibilities. The most successful of those non-U.S. comics and comics characters was Blueberry, which was a pseudonym that the character chose. He was initially a cavalry officer, and then later he became a marshal. The character was drawn, the artwork, and then later the writing as well, by a Belgian artist named Jean Giraud, who was better known by his pseudonym Mobius, one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. And this is one of his signature characters. I think I'm going to have to take back what I said earlier. I'm going to put Jonah Hex as the best comics character and title in the U.S. I think that Blueberry trumped even Jonah Hex. They're wonderful stories. You can read them in the original French, or there were translations of many of them into English that have been released as compendiums or like graphic novels. Like I said, Western comics made made a big comeback in the 21st century. And here's some more examples, some original titles like Loveless and Streets of Glory, and there were many others. The Return of the Lone Ranger to print, and this was a first-time thing for this, Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name character from the spaghetti westerns had his own title for a while, as did Zorro. Zorro made a comeback. In fact, there was even a Django Meets Zorro miniseries that was co-written by Quentin Tarantino. But, as I mentioned before, when we were talking about the weird Western subgenre, in the 21st century, weird Westerns have appeared at a higher rate than regular traditional Westerns in comic books. In fact, it's not even close. So here are some of the many examples of weird Western titles beyond just Jonah Hex and El Diablo and Ghost Rider, who were some kind of weird Western precursors. And finally, I want to take a look at this, probably my favorite of the 21st century Western titles from initially from Image Comics, later IDW, a title called Desperados that sort of walks the line between traditional Western and weird Western. There's some weird stuff that goes on in there. These comics were, they were published off and on between 1997 and 2007. Various different artists. Initially, John Cassidy, who was part of the Lone Ranger comeback. But they were written, all of them, by Jeff Marriott, who is also an author of Western fiction in print, Western novels. So definitely give this one a look if you haven't done so before. Well, I suppose it would be all right for me to talk just a little bit about my own efforts to contribute to this field, a little bit of the story behind the voice you've been listening to for 50 plus hours if you've listened to this whole thing. My first Western fiction that was published was in 1995 in Louis L'Amour Western Magazine, which was a wonderful magazine that I wish had lasted longer. Not long after that, I also started being published with my nonfiction pieces, my history pieces about the West and the frontier, including several articles in Wild West magazine over the next few years, including articles that highlighted people like Bigfoot Wallace and Ben Thompson and Charles Goodnight. In fact, the one I did about Bigfoot Wallace, the Texas Ranger, which is the issue that's there in the upper left, that garnered me my first Spur Award nomination, which then qualified me to join Western Writers of America in 1998. And after that, I had work appear in other what are called popular history magazines, which means stuff that is not written for an academic audience, but for a general audience, and tend to be magazines and periodicals that you can find on the newsstands, magazine racks, and in stores and stuff. Sadly, Wild West and Civil War Times in particular have very recently, just a few months ago, this is 2024 when I'm recording this, finally been canceled, which is an indication of the status of physical magazines, I guess, in our modern world. But it's a very lamentable loss felt by many. In the academic history category, I've had a lot of publications about Appalachia and about the Civil War and about slavery and the history of race. So far as the topics that we've discussed on here, I wrote the chapter on Indian Territory in the Oxford Handbook of American Indian History. I wrote the chapter about Reconstruction in Indian Territory in the book Reconstruction Beyond 150, in which I, among other things, talked about Zeke Proctor, if you remember him. I wrote the section on Fort Laramie for American Indian Places, and I wrote several entries in the 3-volume encyclopedia Native Peoples of the World. I've also just recently had a book published that's about the history of race in comic books called Shaolin Brew, which is kind of focuses on not just, well, it focuses on the history of race, but centers in on the 1970s with kung fu comics and comics inspired by the blaxploitation genre, like Luke Cage, for example, which, by the way, I greatly enjoyed researching and writing that one. The same publisher, University of Mississippi Press, has a book coming out soon about the works of Jack Kirby, the comic book artist that we've been discussing. And I wrote the chapter in that about Jack Kirby's Westerns. In fact, I'm seriously considering, and have already started doing some preliminary work, making my next academic book about the history of Western comic books. Now, back in the fiction field, after my initial kind of first few publications in magazines and so forth, I was in several anthologies over the next few years in the late 90s and early 2000s. One time even managing to get my name above the title, but that was not something that I've been able to do very often. In addition to these anthologies of short stories that were all Western fiction, I also had a piece in The Way West, which was a nonfiction book published by Western Writers of America. I wrote a chapter in there about Ronald Mackenzie, the cavalry officer. I was particularly excited to have the opportunity to contribute short stories to the 2 Lone Ranger short story anthologies put out by Moonstone Press in the 2010s. I guess we can say that now. The second one, the second volume, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Frontier Justice, I got to write the introduction to that one as well. Now, I've had a lot of Western novels published. I've had some traditional Westerns. I've had some sweeping historical epics, historical Westerns covering years often that are, like I said, a little bit more sweeping. And I've written a few weird Westerns. I've also written a lot of short stories, the ones that appeared in those anthologies and magazines back when, literary magazines as well, that I have collected in short story collections, such as the ones that you see here. Some of my short stories, I think, and maybe even some of my books might do double duty as historical fiction and an effort perhaps at literary fiction. I'm not sure if it qualifies or not, but if you're looking at literary in the sense of not many people read it and I didn't make any money, I managed to achieve that distinction, I think. But I have managed to get some recognition in the form of awards from my peers. I have been nominated for a Spur Award 4 times and won twice, and nominated for a Peacemaker Award 5 times and won that one twice. I'm hoping to hammer out another one before all is said and done. Now, also, like some of the other writers I discussed earlier in this video, in addition to writing in the Western genre, I also write crime stories. Actually, I write in a lot of different genres, but westerns and crime slash mysteries have been where I've had the closest thing to success, I suppose. Anyway, now that I have promoted myself shamelessly, like the prostitute I am, we can move on, I suppose. But I encourage you to give some of my writing a try, and maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. I've certainly heard from people who didn't. But let's get back to the topic at hand, which is westerns in pop culture. Spent a lot more time than I thought I would talking about literature, which is perfectly fine because it is a very rich topic. So I've decided that I'm going to have to, instead of doing all this in one volume, break it up. And so this first volume has been about pop culture and the Western genre in print. The next one will be about the Western genre on screen. So hopefully I'll see you then.